Chapter 349. In the quiet temple, Huaishir raised the bell with two claws, opened the lid, and looked inside with wide eyes. It was empty. Fu-Yi. Where's Fu-Yi? Such a big stoat was just here. How did it disappear? Huaishir held the bell and looked at it for a long time in confusion. Then, after touching every inch of the temple, he suddenly turned back and looked at Jonathan. Do you have any clues? Jonathan froze for a moment, then immediately shook his head like a rattle drum. Then he saw Huaishir raise his tail, the great sword upright, and slash at his face. Since you don't have any clues, then don't keep your head. Bang! The great sword slashed at the empty space, and Jonathan actually disappeared like a bubble. Instead, at the tip of the sword, the crystal earthworm, which was tied into a ball by psychokinesis and had its mouth stuffed with leftover iron, was struggling hard. Realizing that Huaishir had noticed it, tears gushed out of its eyes, and it made sobbing sounds. It wanted Huaishir to save it quickly. It didn't know when it started, but it was actually tied up, and what was left in place was just an illusion. Huaishir was silent for a moment, then shook his head helplessly. Fu-Yi, had you had enough fun? If he hadn't slashed at Jonathan in anger, he was afraid that this time she would have really fooled him and taken the opportunity to slip away. So, in the originally empty bell, an illusory stoat that seemed to be condensed by mist poked its head out, glanced at him, and quickly shrank its head back. Not this. Huaishir curled his lips. Change it to a real one. The sound of a bubble bursting came from in front of Huaishir's nose. The stoat squatting there covered its eyes and looked at Huaishir through the gaps between its claws. This should be real, right? Probably. Huaishir couldn't guess it. Anyway, he couldn't tell. He just relied on his understanding of Fu-Yi to trick her. What was that just now, he asked. It's an ability obtained after 3 transformations. Fu-Yi spun in a circle on the spot, showing her body that was becoming thinner and thinner. It was no longer translucent, but rather a blurry silhouette outlined by mist. Even its weight was close to nothing. True illusion can create an illusion that is no different from the real body. It can also talk and attack. However, it's basically useless. It can be broken with a single poke. It's only useful to deceive people. Fu-Yi explained honestly, then asked tentatively, Are you angry? No. Really? Really? Huaishir sighed. Can I still beat you up? He raised his claws and compared the difference between the two of them. Not to mention hitting her, Fu-Yi would be dead with just a slap. They had been good brothers for so many years. How could he do anything just because Fu-Yi had lied to him? You really don't want to go out. He let out a long sigh and looked at Fu-Yi as if he was looking at a friend who had a conflict with her family and was staying in his house. Although he wouldn't chase her away, he didn't want her to keep running away from home either. But if he really wanted to persuade her, how could he? Heaven wanted to rain, and Mother wanted to get married. He couldn't even stop old Fu from arresting people. How could he care so much? Besides, after experiencing a series of blows, Huaishir was no longer arrogant enough to think that he could solve everything in the world. Isn't everything fine? Fu-Yi jumped up and patted his nose. If something happens, I'll be the first to run. How about that? I promise I won't care if you live or die. Besides, without me to cheat, what will you do? Rely on him? As she spoke, she pointed at Jonathan, who was trapped by her. Jonathan's whimpering became louder and louder. He struggled with all his might, but no one cared about him. Well, no matter how he looked at it, he seemed unreliable. Sure enough, he still had to rely on his brothers at critical moments. Can you promise? Huaishir asked seriously. If you want to play games, I can give you all the games in my house. But this is really not a good place for an autumn outing. Besides, autumn is about to end. If there's any danger, or the next time I ask you to quit, can you promise to absolutely comply with my request? I promise. Fu-Yi blinked her big watery eyes and swore with her 2 little paws. Don't worry, old Tai. I haven't reached the point where my parents will lose a daughter because of a little trouble. The dog and the weasel gave each other a high 5 seriously. Huaishir nodded. He lifted Jonathan, who was tied up into a ball with his tail, sent him out of the door, and untied him. That's a separate matter. I can treat your previous concealment as if nothing happened. Huaisher stared at his face. But I don't want this kind of concealment to happen a second time. Otherwise, after you go out, you don't want a professional chef, a calamity musician, and an official military officer of the Central Bureau to come and reason with you. Right? Jonathan nodded like he was pounding garlic. It was really bad luck to encounter this pair of male and female devils. When his desire for knowledge was scared off by Huaisher's threat, a trace of fear finally emerged in his heart. If something really happened to Fu Yi because of his negligence, not only would he not be able to explain it to his teacher, but the creator Niflheim would also give him a hard time. Two creators were giving him a hard time, and a military officer was sharpening his knife. How was he going to live his life? Now, that Huaisher was willing to give him a way out and not pursue the matter, and even let him stay and continue to study the next changes of the gods' remains, he was already thankful. Why would he have so much nonsense to say? They were all mature people who had established their own sections. If he didn't accept the offer, he would be shameless. As for the dignity of a scholar, what was that? As the stone door closed, he also breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. He seized the time to study the changes and operation of the gods' remains. The rare symbiotic ecology among the abyssal creatures was not so easy to encounter. Moreover, it involved the leader of a large group, which was enough to be a research topic. On the way, he habitually opened the map and glanced at it. There seemed to be something wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. He closed the map and put all his thoughts into observing the gods' remains. No one realized that on the map, Fu Yi's name had completely disappeared. Even if they found out, they didn't have to care. It was a small matter, right? A small matter. Thus, Jonathan hummed a song and disappeared into the night. As the botanist from the exploration team sent the summary report over, they're finishing it up. They encountered a new species with some plant, biological, and mineral characteristics at the same time. They're classifying it. The metal scholar has submitted a new metallurgical report and mineral exploration analysis. Exploration of mineral veins. If Jonathan was here, it would be easy to leave this to him. Can you contact him? I contacted him yesterday. It said that he ran to the surface and was specially approved by the creator. Maybe there's another mission? Damn lucky guy, TSK. Can you guys stop quarreling? During the mission, can't everyone be a little less troublesome? Even if I die and my bones rot in the soil, I'll use my rotten vocal cords to shout, geology is not science. Damn it, I haven't even said anything about social psychology. Shut up. Okay, stop arguing. Are you all so free? Where's the research on the social form of the rat people and the goblins? There have been several conflicts in the past 2 days. Do you all need me to brainwash them? Can you guys hurry up and come up with a new social structure for me? I'll speed it up. Also, the external combustion engine has been in place for so long, but the new internal combustion engine hasn't been installed yet. Go and ask the plant group and the mineral group. I've already settled the laws and principles, and I've designed the 8th or 9th version. The utilization rate of the new fuel and metal fatigue problems haven't been solved yet. You can't blame me for this, right? If you ask me, I'll just do it in one step and settle the geothermal power generation group first. There's so much magma, it'll be a waste not to use it. Accumulation of technology, understand? If you try to save time and take this step, you'll have to come back and make up for it all over again. If you have a shortcoming, it'll be a disaster. Save it, you bunch of industrial dogs. Are you sure it's not because you bastard are thinking about riveting steam? Steam power should have been F*King eliminated many years ago. Why can't you bunch of leftovers accept reality? Shut up. You can insult me, but you can't insult my faith. Bullshit faith. I saw you wasting your time the day before yesterday, working on the design of some super large-scale robot used in the decisive battle. You don't slander me with empty words. What's wrong with me working on a robot? How is faith a waste of time? Amidst the laughter and noise, the conference room was suddenly filled with a persecuted and joyful atmosphere. Then, the group of scholars began to quarrel over a new problem. This place was indeed a world dozens of kilometers away from the surface. It was not a strange, demonic realm that surface creatures could imagine. But now, this dark world had long been illuminated by blazing lights. Amidst countless clanging sounds of steel, dozens of large steel pillars soared into the sky. Like lighthouses, they scattered light regardless of day or night, illuminating everything. There were also banners hanging down from the ceiling. They were labeled in both Goblin and Ratman languages. Work happily and return home safely. Be careful and be happy at all times. Racing is prohibited in construction areas. Have more children and plant more trees. The eye-catching scarlet handwriting marked almost every eye-catching place, and the roar of the explosion reverberated throughout the huge construction site. As the river of lava flowed, the metal solution in countless steel furnaces stirred and flowed through the trenches with blazing light. After being cooled, forged, and processed, the metal was turned into parts from the assembly line and transported in large carts in all directions. Everything in sight had turned into a bustling construction site and production base. Under the joint efforts of dozens of scholars, the ignorant goblins, ratmen, and other underground creatures races, as well as the races evolved from explorers, had been combined into a new race and collective. They were fighting for a goal under the control of various consciousnesses and powers of correction. Come to think of it, just as Ong Chong was working, a kobold scholar suddenly raised his head and asked, "We haven't even given this place a name yet." The Red Fox suggested, "How about we call it the Eternal Titan Empire?" Just like other places, there were always contrarians who jumped out. Someone immediately asked, "Where's the Eternal? Where's the Titan? Where's the Emperor?" I think it's not bad. Another scholar who was presiding over the overall situation nodded. "It's much better than the Holy Empire." "I think it's good too. It's settled then." The others nodded and ignored the contrarian's opinion. 10 minutes later, a huge metal plate slowly rose from the embryonic form of the city. Underground World, Eternal Titan Empire. Chapter 350. The next day, the wind started to blow. When Huaishur pushed open the stone door of the temple, he heard that the shrill sound of the wind outside the house was not an illusion. It was like the roar of a hurricane passing through. But in fact, there was no sense of suffocation from the storm. He could only see wisps of grayish-black wind piercing the air, casually sweeping, inextricably spreading between the heavens and the earth. It was like ink that dripped into a water tank and refused to spread. When the wisps of grayish-black wind fell on Huaishur's carapace, he could feel the coldness that pierced into his bone marrow and the sharp sound of a knife colliding with an axe. Sparks flew. Sedimentation tide. It was exactly the same as what was written in the internal information of the Astronomical Society, alongside the febrile wind, gray rain, and invisible flames in the hellish weather. There was no doubt that the depth here had been greatly deepened. It was even faster than originally expected. Otherwise, this kind of astronomical phenomenon, caused by the excessive density of the abyss's sedimentation, would not have formed. When Huaishur climbed up the city wall, he could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. In the rift valley below the city wall, scarlet flowers had grown at some point. Countless crawling like thorns wriggled and grew out of the mud, entangling the remains of the corpses. They stirred wildly, as if they were already unable to endure the thirst. And those flowers, known by their scientific name as the abyss stone garlic, had already bloomed to the extreme, and a sickening sweet fragrance spread out. Huaishur held his breath and stepped back a little. He was no longer a body that was not afraid of poison. Without the mountain ghost's sacred mark, he naturally had to stay as far away from this powerful hallucinogen as possible. After being reminded by Huaishur, the great spirits of the lizardmen naturally knew the danger, and the other beasts who did not know the severity of the situation had already fallen into the cracks in the ground. Not long after, they were sucked by the thorns and turned into shriveled corpses. Countless twisted faces of dark green moss grew along the mud and slowly climbed to the edge of the city wall. Huaishur spat in front of him and heard a wailing sound from the molten iron. The moss shrank down like a living thing. It did not move forward. What the hell? Huaishur looked around at the tragic scene and couldn't help but widen his eyes. Overnight, the depth of the Witch's Night had officially fallen to the average level of the surface hell, which was depth 1. This place was still not a place where ordinary reality realm creatures could survive. Instead, it was an even more bizarre and dangerous place of torture. From the looks of it, today's battle would be even more tragic than before. At the very least, Huaisher couldn't find any giant beasts that could wander around unscathed. It was like a blue circle. How were they supposed to fight if they lost health the moment they entered the arena? In the silence, Huaisher heard the sound of sneaky footsteps in the wind. Behind the tower, 2 figures slowly walked out from the shadows that couldn't be seen from the outside. One of them was an old man with a hunched back. There were traces of a beast on his face, and his ears were long and pointy. It was hard to tell whether he should be called an elf or a donkey man. The other one was the emperor penguin, Twin Moons. Wait! Sensing the hostile gazes of the other giant beasts, Twin Moons raised his short hands first. "We're here to negotiate." "Sorry, we don't have the habit of negotiating with kidnappers here." Ignoring the fact that the other side didn't even have a hostage, Huaisher subconsciously took half a breath and heard Twin Moon spit out words like a cannon. "Wait a minute. At least wait for me to finish. Did you notice that the speed of the depth increase is a bit fast? Or did Jonathan and Antoine not notice anything wrong?" Antoine was also a scholar of the Astronomy Association. At least, he and Huaisher were familiar with a giant bird with a whole tree growing behind it. The whole bird looked green and always made people feel sorry for it. Hearing him say this, Jonathan and Antoine looked at each other. Jonathan gestured at Huaisher with a hand gesture. The gist of it was to wait for him to finish before scolding him. Even though she was unwilling, Huaisher still slowly held her breath. Only a strand of hot metal sparks flew out from between her teeth, scorching hot. "What do you want to say?" the giant bird Antoine asked. "Our progress is behind," Twin Moons said bluntly. "I've calculated. According to the current rhythm of the eternal war and the progress of our transformation, no matter what, it can't be compared to the speed of the depth increase. If we're slow by 1 step, we'll be slow by every step. If we don't evolve to the extent that we can survive in hell before this, then when the disaster comes, it will only be more and more difficult to endure. Don't rush to refute. I've uploaded all the arguments and data to the forum group. Everyone can see it. You can verify whether my words are wrong or not." He took a step back and raised 2 short wings, indicating that he had no intention of attacking. He waited for the 2 to reply. The matters of the scholars were not something that Huaisher could worry about. Just as they were flipping through Twin Moon's paper, he simply sat down and waited for the results. Then he saw that Jonathan and the others' faces were getting uglier and uglier. Obviously, what Twin Moon said made sense. The situation had become so serious that it was beyond their control. What's more, the abyssal transformation here was obvious to all. It seemed that the deepening of the depth would only get faster and faster. In the end, no one knew what the hell this place would become. But no matter what, it was not a paradise to raise living creatures. Instead, it was hell for evil spirits. Seeing that Jonathan and Antoine had finished their calculations and had verified their observation data, Twin Moons opened his mouth to speak again. "If there are no accidents, according to the original number of great spirits, we can have at least 5 explorers who can advance to the level of using the god's remains. But now, after being attacked by the whale yesterday, at least 40 explorers were swallowed at once. The number of explorers dropped from 4 to 3, 7. In other words, there were too many wolves and too little meat. Even raising venomous insects required raw materials. Now that the number of people was getting smaller and smaller, the number of people who could get the chicken dinner in the end also decreased. After a casual attack by the Doomsday whale, a huge gap had appeared in the originally more than enough numbers, and the environment was deteriorating faster and faster. The cold winter seemed to be longer than expected. The great spirits of the lizard men looked at each other, and Huaisher took the lead to ask, "What do you want to talk about? Time is tight, so why don't we be straightforward?" Twin Moons suggested, "Let's join forces, concentrate our firepower, speed up, and destroy the country of the kobolds first." Now, They have the least remaining great spirits, only 14. All the heads can be given to you. We only want the god's remains. Huaisher couldn't help but sneer from his nostrils and roll his eyes. You're dreaming. Both the heads and the god's remains are fine. The specific distribution plan is up to you, but no matter how it is distributed, our side can't get less than 50%. Twin Moons drew the bottom line very straightforwardly as soon as she opened her mouth. If it's not a win-win situation, then it's also beneficial to us that both sides suffer. Please think about it carefully. You've said so much. When the time comes, it'll all depend on our own abilities. Huaisher casually spat a mouthful of molten iron below the city wall and sneered. It's fine if you want to join forces, but who knows if you'll be a traitor. In the end, it was still a matter of trust. But it was good to have problems. After all, problems could always be solved. They were afraid that there was no negotiation. Obviously, they had a certain degree of confidence if they dared to come to the door. Twin Moons glanced behind her, and the stooped old man behind her took out two things from his sleeve: a scroll of silk book and a box. This is the contract and sincerity issued by the dean of the Ancient Spirit Monastery. Twin Moons took a step back and said, "The representative of our monastery wants to see your king. In your dreams." The high priest finally couldn't help but stare at them with his eyes wide open. It's already a great blasphemy to tolerate you heretics breathing the sacred air in the capital. How dare you? But before he could finish, the floor on the city wall cracked open. From the soil under the bricks, a flower of flesh and blood grew out. The ferocious flower of flesh and blood suddenly opened, squirmed, and swallowed the box in the old man's hand. It quickly closed and shrank back into the ground. It was as if nothing had happened. Soon, a hoarse and familiar voice sounded in everyone's ears. I agree. It was the king's voice. It was so straightforward that it was completely out of Huaisher's expectations. According to Huaisher's impression, this kind of alliance would take at least half a month of discussion before there could be a preliminary result, right? In the end, the matter was urgent and the power was given so quickly that Huaisher didn't even have time to react. Then, under the witness of the nameless Lord and your gods, our two sides temporarily cease hostilities and jointly resist the foreign enemy. I hope that this slender lifeline and faith can be continued in the furnace of the end of the world. The old man beside Twin Moons took a step forward and said so. He pulled out a necklace from under his neck. It was a strange sacred emblem. The high priest of the lizard men was silent for a moment and slowly raised a flag in his hand. Both sides reflected each other. In an instant, an inexplicable understanding emerged from the hearts of the lizard men. It was as if they could distinguish between friend and foe. They could distinguish the difference between their allies and other giant beasts, even if they had never met many of them. However, this understanding didn't have the slightest bit of coercion. In other words, it was all based on self-awareness. I advise everyone not to think about backstabbing. It's not worth it. Twin Moons glanced at them and focused on Huaisher. Among us, only a few can survive alone without a group. But once the alliance is torn up, for most of us, it's tantamount to embarking on a dead end. Among you are either scholars of the Astronomical Association or explorers who were invited. There's no need to say more about your rich experience. I believe you all know what's right and wrong. He paused for a moment, and his expression became strange and helpless. You have to know that in this world, we're not the only ones who know how to form alliances. Before he finished speaking, the cries of countless giant beasts sounded on the city wall on the other side. Blood light soared into the sky and descended on dozens of great spirits. The gifts and blessings from the divine remained sprinkled down like rain and dew without hesitation. In an instant, the roars of transformation rose and fell one after another. The evolution ended in an instant. And under the care of sparing no expense, the giant beasts, who had undergone another transformation, looked in the direction of Huaisher and the others. They were filled with the desire for blood. The war began again. Chapter 351. There was no doubt that when the twin moons and the rest represented the ancient spirit monastery to form an alliance with the lizard men, the kobolds and green dwarves had also formed an alliance. Their eyes, which had already turned red under the pressure of cruel reality, looked at each other without any hesitation. Their eyes were filled with ferocity. As the leading giant elephant trumpeted, countless petals of the hell garlic flew up and drifted in the wind of the abyss. The giant beasts gathered into a mighty herd and charged towards them. The war had begun. There was no need for any encouragement or guidance. All the giant beasts had already thrown themselves into the battlefield, ignoring the bloodthirsty thorns and poisonous fog. They had thrown themselves into the battle. Just as Huaisher finished warming up and was about to jump off the city wall, he suddenly heard the king's whisper, "You have to stay." The empty hoarse voice echoed in his ears, causing Huaisher to be stunned. He then heard the king's words, "Bring your companions and come to my palace. All of you have another important task to take care of." Huaisher hesitated for a moment, then suddenly raised his claws and pressed on the tip of Jonathan's tail, causing the crystal lizard that was about to throw itself into the battlefield to stagger. "Follow me." Huaisher gave him a look and slowly retreated. Under the guidance of the priests, he quietly left the battlefield and went straight to the palace. In the dilapidated palace, the stone door of the main hall had already opened. The dusty curtains had long been pulled away, and the king's throne and sacred altar were thus revealed to everyone's eyes. However, it was different from the past. Other than the king, no one dared to stay in the main hall. Countless scarlet flowers of flesh and blood had already grown out from the cracks of the stone. The pieces of flesh and blood that had split open were constantly wriggling and entangling with each other, covering every crack. After looking at it for a long time, it was as if there were countless faint faces emerging from it, overlapping and fusing together, glowing and wailing in a fleeting moment. Those illusionary wails overlapped and became a solemn and ferocious hymn. In a few huge copper furnaces, the holy oil burned vigorously. The fresh blood from the gods emitted a strong fragrance in the fire. The supreme authority was simply and violently stimulated, firmly suppressing the deformity from the abyss, allowing the hunched and skinny king to barely maintain a human form. However, it was only in human form. With the burning of the holy oil and the burning of the candles, the king's consciousness broke free from his old stupor, and his face became dignified and dignified. However, the limbs under the robe were squirming all the time, bursting out with intense changes one after another. They had long been dragged into the abyss by the all-pervasive erosion. Just a hair's breadth away, behind it, on top of the altar, the shriveled and ugly divine remains of the past had also become bright and beautiful. It was like a work of art carved out of glass. Strands of scarlet blood flowed through his body, interweaving into a pair of ever-changing eyes. He casually scanned his surroundings, and his eyes were filled with an almost eternal coldness and indifference. It was as if a god had come back to life, but it was indeed resurrected. More or less, that trace of indescribable horror was quietly operating, overlooking everything that was about to be destroyed. "I feel like you're up to something." Huaisher stopped outside the palace and looked at the king's face. "Is it my illusion? Maybe. But this is not your problem, is it?" On the throne, the king glanced at him with a faint smile. His twitching and deformed fingers wrapped around the scepter beside his knee, wriggling from time to time like the tentacles of a deep-sea creature. It exuded a strange aura. "I'm not boasting, but in this corner of your world, I'm probably one of the best fighters, right?" Huaisher's claws dug into the gap between his teeth. "At such a critical moment, you call me back from the battlefield. Do you want me to praise you? You have other missions. You just need to wait patiently. If I say so, you won't buy it, will you?" The king looked at Huaisher and said calmly, "In short, I need you to protect me, to protect this country, as you can see. Isn't the job of an imperial bodyguard too easy?" Huaisher asked. "I'm afraid I can't do it." "Don't worry. Soon, it will be busier here than outside." The king's gaze swept past them and looked at the silent city outside the palace gate, the last piece of his country. He whispered, "Soon, all of this will be immersed in destruction." Boom! Accompanied by the king's whisper, a loud roar suddenly burst out from the silent capital. Huge cracks continued to appear on the ground, swallowing up the towering buildings that were stacked together. Countless loud, collapsing noises were constantly raised. And in the cracks that suddenly collapsed, ferocious giant beasts emerged from them. The moment they appeared, they caused a tragic death and injury in this city that was full of ordinary things. The singing, moaning, and even desperate cries came to an abrupt end. In the dead silence, only the roars of the giant beasts could be heard. The sudden attack instantly caused heavy damage to the capital. Then, in the direction of the city wall, there was an earth-shattering sound. With the charge of an incomparably large and bloated giant bull, under the cover of many giant beasts, the giant bull crashed into the layers of heavy gates with a whistling sound. The city wall shook, but it was not damaged at all. But then, a terrifying flame burst out from the giant bull's body. Under the modification of the scholars, all of its fat had been transformed into a biological explosive that was tens of thousands of times more powerful than nitroglycerin. At this moment, with the giant bull's self-destruction, the last defense of the lizardmen's kingdom collapsed. The battle line collapsed. When they noticed that someone was behind them, all the giant beasts rushed back without a care for their own safety and fought with the enemy, who rushed into the capital. Huaishir was stunned. He turned around in shock. It was completely unbelievable. "You expected this?" The king did not speak. He only lowered his eyes and stared at the silk letter sent by the ancient spirit monastery. Rather than a letter of alliance, it was more like a request and plea that had never been seen before. Long before this, apart from the lizard men and the ancient spirit monastery, the other three parties had already formed an alliance. As the biggest incentive, a certain husky who was still in a daze did not understand how much of a sense of danger its existence made others feel. The first to bear the brunt of the alliance's attack was the last city of the lizard men. The three guilds worked together to eliminate this bug and their enemies. Next, it was the turn of the ancient spirit monastery, who was weak and alone. With no other choice, the ancient spirit monastery chose to reveal this secret to the lizard men in exchange for a temporary alliance. Otherwise, after the lizard men were destroyed, the fate of the ancient spirit monastery could be said to be clearly arranged. But even if they formed an alliance, there was still a huge disparity in the outcome of 2 against 3. They could only hope to make a last stand before the final struggle, even if it meant perishing together with the lizard men. Under the pressure of the apocalypse, even such a crazy decision seemed to have become logical. At this moment, the kingdom that had been passed down for 3 eras emitted a final cry amidst the rumbling. Countless lizard men fled pathetically between the buildings and were mercilessly trampled into mud. Even the aftermath of the destruction was enough to topple ants. It was a disaster. Looking at the tragic scene in the city in the distance, Huaishir could not help but want to move, but he heard the king's cold voice. "Don't worry about it." Among the countless flowers of flesh and blood, the distorted king said indifferently, "A little impatience spoils great plans. Great spirits, that is not your mission." Huaishir turned around and looked at the indifferent face. He could not understand it at all. "Aren't they your subjects?" he asked in a low voice. "Don't you feel sad? Even the most crazy, ambitious person knew where their power came from, right? Whether it was a wise king or a muddle-headed tyrant, the moment they became a ruler, they should instinctively be aware of the foundation of their royal power. Whether it was to maintain their own power or to show pity and anger as their own kind. Why would anyone make such a choice? Cries, wails, and a final prayer came from afar. The king was dismissive. It was as if he could not detect it at all. He was just cold. He looked down at everything and watched his subjects drown in blood and fire. Finally, he looked at Huaishir and asked calmly and indifferently, "Do I have to cry, beat my chest, and then make an oath while vomiting blood?" He calmly withdrew his gaze. This country does not need that kind of performance, and this world does not need it. As the messengers of God, do you not understand this principle? Huaishir was silent for a long time and suddenly asked, "You didn't let them in on purpose, did you?" The king did not speak. Huaishir did not ask again. He heard the roar of the giant beasts fighting in the distance. There was a constant roar of falling to the ground. The giant beasts that were defeated in the battle fell to the ground, but then they were covered by flowers of flesh and blood that suddenly grew out of the soil, swallowed, and turned into piles of bones. That was the hand of the king. It was a limb that had been imprisoned by its own throne for a long time and had become one with the country. The only deformed monster formed by the combination of the king and the kingdom. The deformed monster that everyone ignored and did not even care about. No, it should be said that this was now the most terrifying opponent in the eternal war, right? The raging deformed flesh and blood, and the squirming flowers of flesh and blood even rushed along the broken city wall into the battlefield in the crack in the ground. They greedily devoured every living thing they came into contact with. Whether it was thorns or flowers, all of them became their food. Its enemy opened the city wall that sealed it and released it from the cage. It did not even wait for it to come to the door. It had already walked into the trap. Accompanied by the faint wails of countless faces, the solemn holy song once again played from the sky. In each flower of flesh and blood, a sad and desperate face appeared, staring at the sky. The flesh and blood opened and closed, chanting piously, roaring ferociously, crying in despair, or praying numbly. It was growing. On the throne, the king finally raised his scepter and faced his kingdom. Then, countless bloodlights fell from the sky. Since the power absorbed from death and slaughter was unreservedly distributed to every great spirit of the lizard men. It was the power of evolution after being transformed by the divine remains and stripped of all distortion and abyssal infection. In an instant, they ushered in another transformation. The first to bear the brunt of it was Huaishir. Compared to the others, the power that was dozens of times stronger poured into his body, violently urging his evolution, causing him to roar at the sky. The roar was like thunder. Chapter 352. That amount of power was simply too great. It was so huge that even Huaishir's body, which represented extreme matter, could not bear it. At least 1/3 of the power of evolution entered his body under the king's favor. Even though Huaishir had given part of the power to Fu Yi, he still had the illusion that he was about to explode. Fortunately, he found that he seemed to have gotten used to the feeling of hovering on the edge of self-destruction. It should be said that he was familiar with it. After all, Crow had already laid a good foundation for him by pulling up seedlings to help them grow. Plus, this monster's body had many huge structures buried in it from the beginning. In just an instant, Huaishir felt that he was about to disintegrate and melt into dust. But then, countless illusionary pop-up windows quickly appeared in front of him. Blood pressure, rise warning. Body temperature, rise warning. Gene induction detected. Heat storage raised to preset value. High-speed growth period begins. Importing preset transformation program. Act 2. The end of childhood. At that moment, the story collection created by the creator of heaven, Hela, about the undefeated beast, Bichimos, quietly entered the second stage. A line of slightly immature and nervous handwriting appeared in the Book of Destiny, and an illusionary chant sounded in Huaishir's ears. It was so familiar. Once upon a time, there was a huge monster called Bichimos. The voice said, its body was like a mountain, huge and terrifying, covering the sky and the sun. Its eyes were like the sun, shining brightly. Its bones and scales were the hardest diamonds in the world, and no sword could scratch them. Its legs were strong and developed, and when it ran, it was like the wind. When it roared, it would reveal 3 rows of sharp teeth, and its teeth were like the sharpest weapons in the world. Its breath was like the corona of the sun's riot, and it could melt the world's strongest city wall. In the vague words, Huaishir gradually fell into a daze. But then, He opened his eyes and let out a thunderous roar, because there was electricity bursting out from his body. The body, which was already so huge that it left people dumbfounded, grew once again. What was even more unbelievable was the blazing light that burst out from the joints and scales. Thunder and lightning. Thunder and lightning enveloped his body, accompanied by a sharp and loud sound of his bones multiplying, scales falling off and growing again. It was as if a heavy hammer had smashed down from the clouds, using this terrifying apocalypse as a furnace to forge indestructible steel. Every cry was accompanied by the pain from the bone marrow, as well as the viciousness that emerged from the gradually awakening blood vessels. Jonathan instantly jumped dozens of meters away and stared in Huai Shi's direction in astonishment. In just an instant, after layers of scorch marks were left on the ground, water vapor rose, and the earth trembled amidst the heavy footsteps. A giant dragon-like creature walked out of the smoke. He had just transcended from his original wolf form. At this moment, the ferocious characteristics of a dragon emerged from his body. As he moved, streaks of sharp lightning jumped from his body, whipping the air, the earth, and the drifting dust. Bring pain to this world that is riddled with holes. Go, Deling on the throne. The aberrated king stared at his back with fanaticism. Today, draw the end of our eternal war, okay? Huai Shi whispered softly, grinned, and slightly lowered his body toward the open door in front of him. The next moment, thunder burst out. Accompanied by the sweeping airwaves, the giant beast had disappeared, leaving only a straight streak of lightning, whipping the earth and leaving a dark scorch mark. Yu's step erupted. In an instant, crossing thousands of meters, Huai Shi descended from the sky and plunged into the battlefield. Facing those stunned gazes, Huai Shi opened his mouth and took a deep breath. The next moment, the metal attack with wild electric light gushed out, converging into a torrent of iron light mixed with thunder, sweeping across the long street. Wherever it passed, everything was shattered. In an instant, more than a dozen giant beasts that were affected burst out cries, covered by the terrifying breath, and half of their bodies were scorched. Then, death suddenly came with Huai Shi's advance. The long tail swept across, wrapped around the greatsword, and, as the lightning on the greatsword burst out, it slashed horizontally, leaving deep slash marks on the ground. Before those giant beasts died, countless flowers of flesh and blood grew out of the cracks, unfolding and sucking the dying giant beasts into broken bones. With the king's gift from the sky, the Deling of the lizard men instantly transformed, and the originally collapsed battlefront was healed again, and they even faintly had the upper hand. But what greeted them was an even crazier attack. After using all their strength to break into the lizardmen kingdom, the explorers who witnessed all of this knew that they had no way out. Either they transformed in the battle, becoming stronger and stronger, completely crushing this country into pieces, or they were completely devoured by the crazy lizardmen. After abandoning the people and the country, the king bestowed all his power to the Deling on his side, turning the battlefield into a cage, establishing a crazy situation that was almost like mutual destruction. The battle became more and more intense, and amidst the constant roars of horror, the half-dragon, half-wolf giant beast galloped on the battlefield with lightning, continuously bringing death to its enemies. From time to time, bloody light would fall from the sky, enveloping its body, constantly replenishing Huai Shi's strength, urging the giant beast to evolve again. Often, just a face-to-face encounter would cause heavy losses. The pure impact, breath, and sharp claws showed an indescribably terrifying power. With the support of this seemingly endless power, Huai Shi was rapidly evolving and slaughtering her way through the battlefield like a rocket. The king's desperate gamble ushered in the results, and Huai Shi did not let it down. After 2 consecutive transformations, Huai Shi, who had reached 6 transformations, had transformed into a meat grinder on the battlefield. We can't let it go on like this. The commander of the giant beasts roared, "Follow me, kill that guy." The huge flying bird soared into the air, spreading its wings. Then, an overwhelming snowstorm with terrifying cold temporarily froze Huaishur in place. Then, more than a dozen giant beasts that had been lurking for a long time pounced, launching their fiercest and fiercest attacks at Huaishur. Whether it was the piercing of lightning, the earth-shaking roar of sound waves, or the collision caused by pure power, in an instant, Huaishur was drowned in terrifying power. But then, in the boiling dust, the fanatical lightning lit up again. The giant beast's figure slowly appeared. Half of its body was charred black, and under the concentrated fire attack, countless scales were broken under the tragic fire attack, slowly walked out, curling the corners of its mouth into a ferocious smile. That's it. He looked at the stunned faces, and his smile became more and more ferocious. No more skills, right? I'm coming. With a sweep of its long tail, the huge blade covered in cracks violently slashed at the dinosaur-like giant beast at the front, cleaving upwards. With a loud roar, the huge giant beast was violently lifted up from the ground by the blade, which was no longer sharp. With a tragic wound, blood splashed out like rain. Then Huaishur opened his mouth, and the metal breath violently spewed out, just like an indestructible sharp blade, wrapped in high temperature and lightning, sweeping across, cutting at the waist. Huaishur shook his head frantically, and the mighty breath swept in all directions, instantly forcing the giant beasts to retreat and heavily injure them. The frost giant bird in the sky screeched loudly, flapping its wings with all its might, trying to increase its altitude. But it was too late. With Huaishur's stomp, the dragon wolf had already soared into the sky, defying gravity and forcibly raised its altitude by hundreds of meters, exactly at the same level as the giant bird. He flashed a ferocious smile at the shocked bird face. In the next moment, the blade slashed down, violently shattering its wings, and the long tail coiled around its body, dragging it down to the ground with itself. The terrifying weight of nearly 100 tons stepped on its spine, and the suffocating wind pressure hit them in the face. Dark hell, bliss fall. Accompanied by Huaishur's joyful shout, the ground rushed over, bursting with a wail, and cracks spread in all directions. And the giant bird had already turned into a pile of meat paste. Amidst the flying dust, the hurricane swept up again. The huge dragon wolf rushed out with a howl. It turned back and spat, forcibly patching up the cracks on the greatsword. Then, it raised its own treasure and smashed it at the invisible home clan at the side. After being broken and reforged several times, the sharpness of the greatsword had already disappeared, but it had become more and more ferocious. Countless broken blades protruded from the body of the greatsword like sharp thorns. The mace, which weighed several tons, broke through the air and with a burst of thunder and lightning, smashed down. The invisible giant wolf let out a mournful wail. At the very last moment, its skull played a perfect note and shattered into pieces. The corpse fell to the ground and was swallowed by the flower of flesh and blood. Once again, a red light descended on his body, causing his body to grow larger. It was as if he had rushed into a kindergarten, beating up a child. When he finally recovered from the battle and looked around, he found that no enemy dared to stand in front of him. Sensing Huaishur's gaze, the dozens of giant beasts took a step back in unison. He really missed the time when he ran to the toilet after the second class to escape from the recess, only to see the frightened eyes of the class teacher behind the door. Don't be afraid. Everyone who came in is a member of the Astronomical Society, so we're all on the same side, Huaishur comforted. No matter what, we're all colleagues. I won't go too far. His sincere expression, his trustworthy words, and his strong sense of camaraderie made the enemies around him breathe a sigh of relief. Then they saw that, accompanied by the gentle words, the ferocious face slowly evoked a cruel smile. It was so pleasant. So before you die, I'll try my best to give you a quick death. Chapter 353. Huaishur was a man of his word. He said it very happily, and it was indeed very happily. To put it bluntly, it was painful and fast. By the time he swung his greatsword V4, the spiked club version, from the top of the city to the bottom of the city, all the giant beasts that dared to invade the city were finished off amidst a sea of blood. As the MVP, Huaishi's dog contributed about 40% of the damage. In other words, almost 30 giant beasts were killed by him with his mace or metal breath. The battle was over. They won. After losing the country and people he protected, the lonely king won. Even if this victory was meaningless in Huaishi's eyes, it was completely putting the cart before the horse. When the giant beasts gathered in front of the palace again, they saw His Majesty the King on the throne in the open hall. He seemed to have regained his former glory. He had regained his youth. Layers of distortion covered his body, and it became inconceivably coordinated, as if negative and negative were positive. Even Huaishi, who was face-blind, felt that among the lizard men, the king's appearance belonged to the handsome and dignified type. Now, the last king held a scepter in his hand and sat on his throne, wise and mighty. He seemed to be in high spirits, but could not hide the deep lethargy and exhaustion in his eyes. Facing the giant beasts waiting for orders, the distorted limbs slowly raised the scepter in his hand, pointing at the collapsed city wall and the empty countries on the other side. Counterattack. Let's offer a final sacrifice to this dying country. He said softly, Great spirits, throw yourself into your war. You could get everything you want there. Accompanied by his words, the last blood light rose from his scepter and enveloped the bodies of the giant beasts, catalyzing their transformation, causing countless fierce auras to soar into the sky. The explorers left without saying a word. Only the king, who was swallowed by distortion, was left on the throne, and Huaishi was left in the hall. He stood in the middle of countless flowers of flesh and blood that were twitching in pain. He tilted his head and looked at the king. Jonathan carefully poked his head out from afar and watched this scene. He excitedly recorded all kinds of data to witness the arrival of the end. Why did you stay behind, great spirit? Amidst the layers of distortion, the king struggled to raise his slender neck. His twisted face scrutinized Huaishi. Why do you insist on coming to see my unbearable ugliness? Although I've always suspected that you had ulterior motives, you've never harmed me. On the contrary, I've benefited a lot from you. Huaishi raised his sharp claws and tore apart the flower of flesh wrapped around his wrist. He flicked it away and looked up at him. But whether it's a human or a dog, there has to be a beginning and an end, right? The king did not say anything. Amidst the wails that gradually sounded, faces of pain emerged from the flowers of flesh and blood. They were the people who were immersed in the abyssal distortion, the lizard men who were infected with plague and erosion. Whether it was the ascetic monks or the high priest, almost all the lizard men had been integrated into the king's body at this moment. The distorted limbs could not hide the wails of the countless souls. They opened their eyes in the eternal darkness and suffocation, shed tears of blood, and looked up at the dark sky. But they still prayed fervently. They prayed that this endless suffering could end, to end this eternal pain. Behind the king, the eye of the divine remained shattered without a sound. The last bit of blood fused into his body, causing his aberration to completely cross the boundary of the taboo. He violently drew out endless abyss sediment and plunged deeper into the abyss. This is your plan? Huaishi sighed softly. Completely integrate yourself with the divine remains, become a monster, and seal the consciousness of all the people in your body? In this way, can you survive the arrival of the end of the world? This is the king's duty, isn't it? A hoarse and indistinct voice sounded from the king's body that was gradually transforming. It sounded so weak. This is the price we have to pay. In order to survive, in order to continue living, in order to protect the kingdom, in order to complete his mission and duty. The price he had to pay. If it was just to endure the torment of pain, this price could be said to be frivolous and cheap. It was too worth it. At this moment, with the hoarse wails, he finally truly integrated with his kingdom. This will only drag the entire kingdom down into the abyss, right? Huaishi looked down at his ugly appearance with pity and slowly shook his head. This is not a problem that can be solved with determination. Their weight is too heavy. You can't hold it. Hundreds of thousands of patients infected by the abyssal plague had terrifying erosive power. In an instant, the king would be assimilated into a monster in the abyss. Even if it relied on the godly remains, it could not bear such a terrifying weight. They would only fall into hell along with their kingdom. At least we're still alive, aren't we? From the warts and messy limbs, the king raised his head. With tears of blood, he smiled at Sui Xiong with difficulty. At least we can still exist, God. Almighty God, you are so merciful. You have never bestowed complete annihilation. If this is our fate, our original sin, then I will also gladly endure it. In the roars and wails of countless people, the king's face gradually melted. He spread his arms and was entangled by countless flowers of flesh and blood. He completely lost his outline. Only countless hideous mouth parts covered with sharp teeth were left on countless faces. They cried out hungrily at the sky. The earth trembled. The palace shattered. From the loud noise, dozens of huge tentacles rose from the ground. They pulled the king's bloated and burdensome body and propped up his deformed body. It was a terrifying shadow that covered the sky like a spider. It was bathed in painful flames. The red color covered the distorted faces. It was as if it was born from the womb of the abyss and was born in this painful world. The king's wish was fulfilled. His great cause was a success. At the same time, it could also be called a failure. It finally lost its nature under the erosion of the abyss and was immersed in endless appetite and madness. This kind of a barren evolution could not be considered survival at all. At best, it was just struggling at death's door in the end of the world. It might not even be long before it collapsed, fragmented, and turned into other messy things. It might even rot completely, until the true evil consciousness transformed from the pain of hundreds of thousands of souls and turned into a brand new existence. Like a parasite in a cicada's body, it broke out of its shell when the countless hungry cries soared into the sky. Fu Yi finally could not help but speak. Should we go? We can go, but it's not necessary. Huaisher shook his head and suddenly said, Do you want to know what I do on a daily basis? Fu Yi was puzzled. Although I really want to say that I'm protecting the peace of the present realm or fighting against evil forces. In fact, after thinking about it for a long time, I realized that in the end, I'm just doing whatever I want according to my own temperament. Huaisher sighed. Even if I occasionally do something good, it's just a coincidence. It's not worth writing about or being thanked. Sometimes, I accidentally make a mess and have to rely on others to clean up the mess for me. It's so embarrassing, it's not good at all. He paused, tilted his head in thought, and then said seriously, But I have to say, it's really cool to do whatever you want. It's as cool as playing an idiom. Although to a certain extent, it could be equivalent to seeking death. Even Huaisher herself found it hard to believe that after experiencing so much, he hadn't changed in the slightest. As always, he was stubborn. Crow was actually right. After gaining power, most people would do whatever they wanted. Huaisher was no different from others. If there was a difference, it was just that what he wanted was more extravagant than what others pursued. So what do you want to say? Fu Yi sighed. You don't want to be a human anymore. Now that I've become a dog, how can I be a human? Huaisher shook his head. I'm just informing you in advance that there's a high probability that I won't be able to carry you anymore. You still remember what you promised me, right? He took a step back and kicked the crystal lizard that was intoxicated in research and records, indicating that it was time for him to work. You should go, Huaisher said. If things don't go well, I'll leave soon. Fu Yi clicked her tongue and reluctantly got out of the bell, pursing her lips. She glared at Huaisher one last time, then turned and walked into the light door opened by Jonathan. In the brief silence, Huaisher frowned. Fu Yi, don't make trouble. No one responded. She really left? Huaisher asked. Jonathan nodded like he was pounding garlic. After confirming that Fu Yi had left through the records of the astronomy meeting, Huaisher was relieved and wagged his tail, indicating that this guy should stay away. Finally, he looked at the monster that was hissing and preparing to leave. Hey, In comparison, Huaishur, who could only reach the first joint of the monster's leg, raised his head and said, "Do you want to fight?" In order to make his presence felt, Huaishur opened his mouth and spat on the king's shoes. If it still had shoes. In short, the effect was outstanding. As the scorching molten iron churned, the spider-like monster of flesh and blood roared angrily. It suddenly raised one of its huge legs and stomped down on Huaishur. In the roar, the air burst out and swept in all directions. In the flying dust, the outline of the dragon wolf gradually appeared. I'll take it that you agree. Chapter 354. I'll take it that you agree. Following Huaishur's words, the dancing dust suddenly shook and was torn apart by the lightning. Amidst the dragon wolf's roar, Huaishur rushed out towards the huge monster. Wherever he passed, the lightning was like a knife, leaving a deep burn mark on the thick-legged trunk that was covered with limbs. It was as fast as lightning. In the blink of an eye, after crossing hundreds of meters, Huaishur rose into the air and opened his mouth at the squirming flesh supported by the 16 thick limbs. Flashes of hot metal burst out. Immediately after, Huaishur saw the squirming flesh suddenly split to the sides, and a limb that changed constantly like a hand grew out from it. It suddenly unfolded the membrane at the tip of the finger, and against Huaishur's metal breath, it broke through the air towards his face. Slap! The palm that was burned to ashes smashed onto Huaishur's body like a pillar. It flew backward. Like a wild dog that was kicked into the air, it spun in the air awkwardly and landed on the ground. Then, it felt the whistling of the wind and rushed forward. Behind him, thick limbs continued to smash down, causing the crumbling city to become more and more broken. Amidst the roar, the earth shook and the mountains shook. Huaishur was so scared that his tongue was hanging out. Generally speaking, the larger the creature, the slower its speed. Why was the king unbelievably fast after turning into a monster? He finally understood one thing. Even if it looked like a squirming lump of rotten meat, it could unreasonably extract the flesh of other parts and grow new limbs at any time. It was equivalent to being able to change the position of all organs at any time. Even if he attacked from a blind spot, in the next moment, the blind spot would become a front. It was not just 360 degrees. Even the top and bottom had no gaps or weaknesses. What was even more frightening was that it seemed to be constantly evolving. After being burned by the lightning, its body began to tremble rapidly. A terrifying high temperature was emitted, causing hot steam to spurt out from its body like a high-pressure water pump. Then its body suddenly shrank by a third. But what was even more difficult was that the surface of its limbs quickly hardened and dried, turning into pieces of chitin structure like insulation tiles. Big armored spider. Huaishur sucked in a breath of cold air. Then, she saw the giant spider running towards her. Its huge shadow shrouded the husky's face, and its razor-sharp limbs trampled on the husky's face. The speed was extremely fast. He didn't even need to use recoil, yet he was able to fire more than 108 shots per second. Countless crisscrossing cracks appeared on the ground, and the broken walls were cut into 2 halves, 4 halves, 8 halves, and even more fragments flew out in all directions. In his haste, Huaishur was hit by a slash. He found that the thick scales on his back had a leukoplakia mark on them. Huaishur's non-existent hair stood on end, and his tail stood up in fright. He ran for his life, narrowly avoiding the slash of the saber feet. Then he suddenly reacted. That's not right. I have defenses too. I've already turned into a dog, an armored and bulletproof teenage dog. It won't be able to kill me with one slash. So what's there to be afraid of? Face it head on. Don't be afraid. Anyway, I'm a superhuman. I almost forgot that I still have the cheat of the confining hand. Huaishur turned his head, and after applying another layer of iron paste on his scales, he suddenly turned around and rushed towards the king spider that was eroded by the abyss. Wolf advance. Phoenix soars to the moon. He ran wildly and jumped into the air against the slash of the saber feet. He aimed his sharp feet at the king spider's abdomen and flew out like a cannonball. Southern Battle Dragon Wolf Cannon Fist. Boom! In a loud noise, the iron dragon wolf broke through layers of slashes and crashed into the king spider's face. Well, if it had such a thing as a face. Anyway, Huaisher specifically chose a place with more eyes and faces. After hitting the king spider, Huaisher felt that after breaking a layer of carapace, he hit a layer of rubber wall, and the impact was completely dissolved. Then, he flew backward. Damn, there's a buffer layer? He only saw blood splatter and then quickly coagulate. Although it didn't seriously injure it, the effect was still outstanding. The king spider staggered back a few steps and almost couldn't support its body. Huaisher also felt that his vision turned black, and he had a concussion. With the king spider's roar, one of its saber feet suddenly changed from light and sharp to heavy and thick, looking like a door sword. It seized this fatal gap and slashed towards Huaisher's head. The premonition of death broke out. Huaisher didn't hesitate, and his tail picked up the blade behind him, raised it, and blocked in front of him. Then, he flew backward again. When he landed awkwardly, he saw that the big sword hanging on his tail had layers of cracks. As the tail loosened, the big sword fell on the stone, and this ownerless sword broke into two pieces from the middle. Huaisher felt a heartache when he saw this. Although he didn't maintain it as diligently as usual these 2 days, he always connected it from time to time. Now it was completely gone. What a pity. Eat my mule kick. In anger, Huaisher stomped his 4 feet and suddenly flew into the air. After spinning 7,200 degrees in the air, like a spiral armor-piercing dog, he suddenly kicked at the giant spider with his back foot. Electric, venomous dog drill. A tragic gap burst out. Before the king spider could fight back, Huaisher took the opportunity and flew into the sky again. He suddenly curled up his 4 legs and shrunk into a ball. At first glance, it looked like a tire covered with spikes, entwined with electric light, and spinning wildly. Then, the iron light of the hand of confinement burst out from it. Huaisher suddenly had an idea and applied the power of the axe of wrath to himself. Now more than 40% of his body was made of alloy. At this moment, after the sudden pain, the sharp scales all over his body appeared restless red. It was like a flame rising. A fierce weapon awakened in his body. At this moment, the dog was the axe, and the axe was the dog. Even Huaisher admired himself for being able to come up with such a messy idea. But as long as it could be used, who cares? Following Huaisher's roar, the crazily spinning dragon wolf descended from the sky. Invincible wind flame wheels. As it spun wildly, the axe of wrath slashed down, then slashed again, 3 slashes for slashes, 5 slashes, 6 slashes, 8 slashes, and so on. In an instant, it was unknown how many slashes it had made, but it actually tore open a bloody wound on the king spider's body. The physical damage was secondary. What was more serious was the origin substance attack. The origin substance was wrapped in the dragon wolf's rage and savagery. The violent origin substance deeply wedged itself into the king spider's chaotic consciousness, causing the countless lizardmen's souls to instantly collapse. Huaisher ignored the crazily spinning darkness in front of him. The moment he landed, he once again charged towards the thick limbs in front of him, his sharp iron tail sweeping horizontally. Giant axe-chopping tree. Boom! Amidst the loud noise, the thick limb formed from countless wriggling flesh was cleanly cut into 2. The messy giant spider had lost a leg, and its blood rained down like rain. However, it didn't seem to hurt or itch at all. After all, it had so many legs, so one more or one less wouldn't make a difference. However, there was no doubt that Huaisher had angered it. Countless distorted faces gathered together, forming a sinister mouthpiece. It opened its mouth and roared angrily at Huaisher. Immediately after, it spat out a viscous, dark green venom. The venom was like a flood, burning with a dark green light. It didn't look like anything good at first glance. Huaisher was so scared that he hurriedly fled. Wherever the venom passed, the rocks would sizzle and burn into a pile of mush, emitting a foul stench. Too much acid in your stomach means that your stomach isn't good. Huaisher sucked in a breath of cold air and sincerely warned, "You need to work less overtime, take more medicine, and have a regular schedule." Stomach problems need to be treated as soon as possible, understand? The king spider sprinted over. It seemed that it understood. In addition, it raised its sharp, blade-like legs once again, expressing its gratitude to Huaishur. This thing had gone berserk. When he saw it casually slice open a crack in the ground that was large enough to bury him, Huaishur's eyelids twitched wildly, and he hurriedly retreated. However, as he sprinted, his body emitted a cacophony of metallic sounds. Countless scales and carapace trembled, and under the cover of the origin substance, he began to change again. In the blink of an eye, his originally thick and ferocious body became nimble and slender, and a faint, dark green fog began to spread from his body. Wherever it passed, pure white irises began to grow. Spear of Compassion. Huaishur hadn't expected that after changing the status of the weapon on his body and strength would also change. The current him was more than twice as fast as before. When the lightning flashed, no one could even clearly see where his body was. There were illusions of dragon wolves everywhere. Antelope Gallop. Huaishur stepped on the blade-like legs and leapt into the air once again. Sloth Kick. As Huaishur shot through the air, the sharp claws on his hind legs also shot out, tearing open a gaping wound on the king spider's body. The poison from the azure crown dragon seeped into the spider's flesh, causing its tough carapace to rapidly age. The poison of aging seeped deep into the spider's bones. Fresh blood spurted out from the wound, but immediately afterwards, countless thin, long tentacles shot out from the wound, attempting to entangle Huaishur, who was powerless to change directions in midair. However, at this critical moment, Huaishur's tail suddenly extended. Under the effects of the Spear of Compassion, he unilaterally applied the power of the sorrowful rope to his tail, causing its length to explosively increase. As Huaishur swung his body, his tail wrapped around one of the spider's legs. He suddenly pulled, causing his body to float through the air, easily dodging the pursuing tentacles. As he floated through the air, he even managed to entangle the spider's other two legs. Immediately afterwards, Huaishur roared. Black tiger preying on trapped lamb. Chapter 355. The blood-red glow of the sacrificial blade began to glow on Huaishur's back. Layers of beautiful carvings began to appear on the blade-like scales. As Huaishur charged forward, the carvings instantly severed two of the spider's legs, sucking in its blood and causing the severed limbs to wither and wither. Huaishur, on the other hand, felt as if he had been greatly nourished. He could feel a steady stream of blood and energy flowing from his back. His body began to swell once again, and his aura became even more ferocious. He had finally grasped how to use the imprisoning hand on this body. This power was even more frightening than he had originally imagined. After all, his original body didn't have so much strength, nor did it have so much origin substance for him to use as he pleased. It was as if he had become a giant monster. Huaishur howled excitedly. The sacrificial blade and sorrowful rope retracted, once again switching to the Spear of Compassion. The azure crown dragon's poison began to spread, preventing the Spider King from mutating. Amidst the continuous attacks, the Spear of Compassion's attacks caused the berserk spirit to gradually calm down. It even became tamed and peaceful, no longer causing any chaos. This was how the Spear of Compassion was used. It used its own speed to continuously attack. It didn't aim for a single blow, but rather used its own strength to weaken and suppress the enemy as much as possible, causing the enemy to gradually age under the effects of the Azure Crown Dragon's poison. In the end, the enemy would completely lose their will to fight under the assault of the Spear of Compassion, waiting helplessly for death. Even with Huaishur's current strength, he couldn't just wait helplessly for death. He could at least eliminate the corrosive seed's most troublesome regenerative ability and berserk will. Immediately afterwards, he made full use of this precious opportunity. The power of the axe of wrath chopped down. The Spider King once again cried out in pain. Fresh blood began to flow from its wriggling flesh, Speaking of which, how many times had it spat out blood already? Having a lot of HP really was impressive. Huaisher clicked his tongue and sighed. He slowly retreated 2 steps, just barely dodging a wave of the spider's furious attacks. He gathered his strength slightly, preparing to deal a vicious blow. In the next moment, Huaisher shouted, "Wolf attack!" But in reality, it was a dragon wolf cannonball, which was a spiral armor-piercing dog that shot through the air again. After breaking through several layers of defense with his sharp horns, he soared into the sky, hovering above the Spider King, and looked down. Then he fell straight down, descending from the sky. In the sky, Huaisher had already used the same trick. His entire body was curled up, and blazing electricity rose from his scales. The invincible wind-fire wheels had reappeared in the world. A trick that had been used once was useless against the corrosive seed. The Spider King roared angrily and suddenly crouched down. Dozens of sharp tentacles rose from its squirming main body and pierced towards the sky like a forest of spears. Facing the countless piercing cold lights, Huaisher's body had already started to spin crazily. Crazy electric light descended from the sky, instantly tearing apart the layers of spikes. However, more and more tentacles had already surrounded him. He was trapped in a cage. It was at this moment that a large dog head popped out of the invincible firestorm wheels. It opened its mouth and grinned at the tentacles that were closing in on it. Huaisher took a deep breath. Metal Breath LV3 Gold Collection Enhanced Version V3. 0. Volcano burns the farm. In the next moment, flames erupted from Huaisher's throat. It was a vast metal torrent that had evaporated into iron mist. Violent electric light was wrapped on it, piercing through the dark sky, causing all the explorers to raise their heads in shock. It stung their eyes. What was even more exaggerated was the origin substance that had erupted from it. Regardless of whether it was the axe of wrath, the sacrificial knife, or the spear of compassion, all the weapons that could be used to attack were applied to this breath. In an instant, all of Huaisher's origin substance shattered and fused with every particle of metal breath, causing the countless whistling torrents of metal breath to turn into small weapons that were fleeting and hard to see. This was a terrifying move that was comparable to the firepower of a heavy machine gun. In an instant, countless origin substances and physical attacks had been launched. It was even a siege heavy machine gun that had been burned by high temperatures, metal storm, or to use a simpler and more crude method to describe it. Light cannon. As the invincible wind-fire wheels spun wildly, the light cannon fired wildly. It was like a long sword that could pierce through the heavens and the earth. It turned back and slashed, instantly piercing through and tearing apart the Spider King's ferocious body, causing countless surging flesh and blood to be charred and fall apart. The tentacles were broken and burned to ashes. A huge bloody hole had already appeared on the Spider King's body. It was the mark left behind by Huaisher when he had pierced through it. What was even more shocking were the countless violent slashes around the bloody hole. This was a terrifying attack that Huaisher's body could never hope to achieve. Every single slash was enough to cut the Spider King into pieces. The only reason it was still able to stick together was because of the remaining vitality in its flesh. It was as if it had been pieced together with glue. However, it could no longer support its body. It collapsed to the ground, along with Huaisher, who was in the deep hole. By the time Huaisher crawled out of his daze, he finally felt a wave of indescribable exhaustion. This was the first time he had felt such an exaggerated amount of pain and exhaustion from a giant beast body. It was as if it had lost all of its strength. This was the result of talking too much. And the results of this battle were so great that it was difficult for anyone to even dream of. Even he himself couldn't believe it. As if it had seen through his strong exterior, the ground trembled. A giant beast that had been hiding nearby poked its head out of the ground and brazenly attacked him. Huaisher didn't even have time to turn around before he felt the wind blow against his face. A sharp tentacle brushed past his cheek. It pierced through the wailing giant beast and wedged it deeply into the stone. Then, the tentacle broke and quickly hardened, turning into a stone-like texture. In the dead silence, other than the wailing of the giant beast, there was only the sound of the spider king slowly crawling up. The three remaining knife legs propped up its charred body. On the countless broken faces, the resentful eyes had slowly closed, as if they had fallen into a deep sleep. And in the blurry flesh and blood that had been opened up, the king's upper body vaguely appeared. He looked at Huaishur and gave a wretched smile with difficulty. "Big spirit," it asked softly, "is this really okay?" Huaishur grinned at him indifferently. He propped up his body with his claws, climbed up, moved forward, and reorganized his posture. He didn't answer. He just used his actions to express everything straightforwardly. "Have you decided?" The king stared at his determined eyes and asked in a trembling voice, "Won't you regret it? Big spirit, are you really willing to bear such a heavy burden? If you have time, isn't it good to breathe more fresh air?" Huaishur stepped forward and told him expressionlessly, "Don't think that I'm easy to talk to. In fact, I'm the kind of person who exterminates evil and does everything to the extreme. Once I start to run amok, I won't even let a disabled person go. So, if you're targeted by someone like me, you should just consider yourself unlucky." Then, the king's smile became clearer. He was full of gratitude. It was as if he had been saved. "Come on then, great spirit, come on." He widened his eyes in ecstasy. The deformed spider spread its knife legs again, showing the last despair and fierceness from the erosion of the abyss. "You, who inherited this god's remains, will definitely be able to replace us as the proof of our existence, and continue to exist in the future. Continue to exist." The hoarse whisper turned into a bestial roar in the end. In the last obsession of all the lizard men, countless faces opened their eyes at the same time. They prayed fervently, chanted hymns, and launched a final attack on Huaishur. Lightning soared into the sky again. The dragon wolf roared. Then, a blazing iron light flashed and disappeared. As the dragon wolf and the spider intertwined, it came to an abrupt end. From the spider's chest, another ghastly wound appeared amidst the shattered flesh. Countless crimson tendons that looked like nerves and blood vessels floated in the air, still connected to each other. And on Huaishur's face, there was a sharp knife mark. Terrible blood flowed slowly from the broken face. In the dragon wolf's huge mouth, there was a hideous sarcoma that was still pulsating. It looked like a heart. One could vaguely make out the original appearance of the god's remains and the deformed body of the king that had merged into it. At the last moment, the shriveled face raised with difficulty, revealing a smile of relief. Then, as Huaishur pulled with all his strength, the last connection was suddenly torn off. The dragon wolf's teeth suddenly closed. The god's remains were broken. A trace of blood flowed out from between his teeth. "Thank you." In a trance, Huaishur seemed to have heard such a voice, but then the illusory whisper dissipated in the wind and could no longer be heard. What replaced it was the roar of a waterfall. It was the color of blood. Endless blood surged out from the spider's remains, covering the sky and the earth. It turned into a vortex, covering Huaishur and wrapping him in it. In the pale white fog that rose in spirals, sorrowful faces appeared one after another. Along with the blood torrent, they plunged into Huaishur's body. The despair, pain, and endless abyss of hundreds of thousands of lizard men swallowed Huaishur. Then, the violent power of evolution burst out from the fragments of the god's remains and poured into his body. The terrible transformation and rebirth once again played out in this endless blood. But this time, there were countless solemn chants. It was a sacred and solemn song. Countless sorrowful prayers, desperate cries, and even the final whispers of unwillingness rubbed against each other, bursting out the solemn song of begging for relief and redemption. But hundreds of thousands of deaths overlapped together, pulling and drowning Huaishur's consciousness, pulling him inch by inch into the depths of the abyss. A terrifying aura from hell erupted from the blood, sweeping and instantly drowning the entire city, completely turning this broken country into an out-and-out demon realm. In the deepest part of the demon realm, in the blood that was tainted black by the abyss. A blazing light suddenly lit up. Then there was a terrifying roar that shook the sky and the earth. The world was furious. Huaishar opened his eyes. Chapter 356. Above the broken sky, turbid waves surged into the sky. Tens of thousands of tons of seawater were swept up by the shadows in the abyss. Those wild waves collided with each other, bursting out the high-pitched roar of steel rubbing against each other. Accompanied by the high-pitched cries in the deep sea, sharp and heavy icebergs rose from the deep sea one after another, emitting a terrible cold. Frost spread. A cold storm swept through, instantly freezing a thick layer of ice between the surging tides. It was as if a huge ice island had risen from the deep sea. It was slowly controlled, shaped, and completely transformed by some kind of violent force. In the end, it turned into layers of cold walls that sealed off the area. It resisted the vicious rays from the sky, as if the malice of the entire world had gathered here, in the crazily rising and falling depth index. The precipitation of the abyss had already dyed the dark green ocean into pitch black. High up in the sky, endless tyrannical light shot down from the crack that seemed to have shattered, tearing apart countless icebergs. It was unstoppable. It was like a blade of punishment slashing down from the sky. Heaven's wrath. It was only a slight movement, but it stirred up the entire icy sea, causing countless frozen icebergs to fall apart, shatter, and even boil again, turning into terrifying steam. Then, they quickly froze in the cold hurricane, turning into fog that did not disperse, spreading between the sea and the sky. Then, the fog was torn apart again. Violent waves of air swept in all directions. It was because a ray of intense light descended from the sky. Everywhere it passed, everything was torn apart in a violent ravage. It was impossible to tell whether it was flames or lightning. It was only a piece of magnificent crystal the size of a thumb, but it was the essence of destruction. As one terrifying crystal after another fell from the sky, the entire ice sea was glowing and wailing. It was shaken, torn apart, smashed, and even evaporated. Compared to such a heavenly might, such a huge and violent ocean was not worth mentioning. The violent ravage lasted for an unknown period of time until the deep ocean was peeled off layer by layer. It was like peeling off an onion. The huge monster hidden in the deep sea revealed its ferocious face. Even though it had been severely injured by the heavenly might, the bloody light in the 9 pairs of eyes was still violent. Under the protection of countless ocean currents and ice crystals, the pitch-black 9-headed serpent coiled above the dry seabed. The underwater volcano had already erupted under such a terrifying shock, but the splashing lava was like an illusion, unable to leave a single burn mark on its scales. It was the rebirth of the legendary Hydra. The mountain-like Hydra stretched out its neck and roared, creating layers of violent waves of air. It faced the sky and pulled at the endless 7 seas, launching its own counterattack. Their instinctive control over the seawater did not cause the huge waves that they had before. Instead, as the frosty wind blew out from the 9 giant mouths, the seawater was frozen into ice that was not inferior to any steel. The ice was growing like a tree sprouting branches and leaves. From this vast ice field that was formed in an instant, the crazily growing ice formed a base that was even sturdier than steel. It was constantly adjusted according to the standards of the most rigorous war fortifications. In the end, as the torrent rolled, what emerged from the water were countless ice cannons that were aimed straight at the sky. In the blink of an eye, the vast ice field was occupied by a forest of cannons. If one were to look at it from afar, they would definitely be shocked by this unbelievable scene, right? But now, there was no spectator who dared to come within a radius of millions of miles. Everyone who thought that they were lucky had long been torn apart by the intense light. In the next moment, following the Hydra's roar, the vast ice field suddenly trembled, bursting out with an unprecedented roar. As countless waves of air violently swept out, the spectacular ice-metal forest instantly fell apart. It was destroyed by its own explosive power. Following the shattering of the ice field, almost endless cannonballs had already soared into the sky, tearing through the turbulent hurricane and soaring to an extremely far place in an instant. The cannonballs that were originally the height of an ordinary person now looked like fine grass seeds, unable to be seen clearly. After the grass seeds drifted into the crack in the sky, the power hidden within them erupted abruptly. Layers of complicated secret techniques spread out from within. After this fleeting alchemy skill flashed past, terrifying ice clouds that had already reached absolute zero had already sealed, covered, blocked, and even forcefully closed the shattered sky. Behind the frozen sky, rumbling sounds kept erupting. An intense light kept appearing and disappearing. In the end, the heavenly might that had already exhausted its power could no longer tear apart the Hydra's defense. As endless ice and snow fell from the sky, the crack that seemed to have come from hell slowly closed. It had finally survived the heavenly punishment from the Night of the Witch. Above the frozen sea, only the Hydra was panting tiredly. The breathing of the 9 huge mouths was like a hurricane, stirring up chaotic ocean currents. Purely from the perspective of alchemy, this giant beast body is really convenient. The Hydra muttered to itself, "If this was my original body, not to mention the scale of alchemy, even if it was only a fraction of a million, it would be enough to squeeze my origin substance dry." It paused for a moment, and the leftmost head tilted slightly. It saw a shadow projected in the void. "Lord Shay, what brings you here?" Its attitude towards its partner was not close. Its tone towards the Creator, who was supposed to be high and mighty, was also not respectful. As an alchemist, such an attitude was not strange. No, if it were an alchemist with a more traditional background, such an attitude would be considered intimate. After all, to an alchemist, even if they respected the Creator, they would at most stay at a respectful distance. Even though they were from the same school of scholars, both sides had already separated due to differences in ideology. Even before the appearance of the first creator in history, the conflict between both sides had already become increasingly acute. Under the oppression of the church, the scholars banded together to establish the pioneer society, but excluded the alchemists. Of course, part of the reason for this was because of a dispute between monetary interests and sovereignty. But more of it was because the direction that both sides pursued was completely opposite. If the scholars were to create laws in order to create a reality, then alchemy was to seek knowledge from the abyss. What the alchemists yearned for was the prototype of miracles, the spring of essence that flowed from the bottom of hell, the depths of the abyss, the eternal mysteries. In short, it was something that was absolutely unscientific. Since early on, the scholars had resisted and discriminated against existences outside the reality due to the danger of the abyss. They focused on studying knowledge that existed in the world of the living. As for the dead world, they would explore it after death. Thus, they turned a blind eye to the disasters and miracles that the alchemists thirsted for knowledge. Even the scholars would occasionally quarrel with each other over certain laws, let alone the alchemists. It was normal for both sides to hate each other and even pretend not to see each other when they saw each other. Being able to greet each other, in addition to the contract between both sides, was already a sign of respect for the noble title of the Creator. "Lord, there is no need. I am still 2 generations behind your master, Garland Dion. There is no need to be so serious." Shay's projection waved his hand indifferently. He lowered his head to look at the data on the spiritual probe and sighed softly. Although the transformation of the coral remains is fast, it is ultimately limited to the ocean. Now it seems that even if more supplements are added later, the interference from the source will still have a certain impact on the consequences of fusing with the divine remains. The ocean is the cradle of life, but there is ultimately a limit. If it is a creature on land, it will definitely be more convenient, right? The Hydra glanced at its body that was rapidly recovering. "I will continue to supplement this, but I will leave the specific life framework to you." This is naturally part of my duty. There is no need to say more. Shay tapped the tablet in his hand. Instantly, countless complicated data jumped out. Hormones, blood pressure, bone structure, blood composition, and even the blueprints of the embryonic forms of organs. Under the guidance and movement of those few fingers, the huge behemoth was disassembled into hundreds of thousands of different structures. After fine adjustments, they were reassembled. Even if there was no difference on the surface, in fact, it was almost a completely different existence on the inside. It was Chancheng. In an instant, based on the current Hydra, a terrifying monster that did not exist in reality had been created. Regardless of whether it was the innermost genes, cell structure, or the design of the 16 subbrains, everything was perfect as if it had gone through the test of thousands of years. If the Hydra was a race car, then the current Shea was its designer, engineer, and even adjuster. Every detail was firmly grasped in his hands. The adjustment this time has used a brand new structure. Although it is slightly radical and risky, it should not be a problem for you now. In just a few minutes, Shea clapped his hands and completed the task. I have specially left 6 extra subbrains for your alchemy array, and there are also special glands that can convert your blood into source substance in a short time to replenish your consumption. After thinking about it, toughness and adaptability are indeed the most important. If it is a battle of attrition, you will not have any opponents. Okay, as Shay's representative, the alchemist Gulialu had no objections. At the end of the day, he knew that he would most likely become a tool in this exploration. However, he was tempted by the mystery of the abyss contained in the Night of the Witch and still chose to come. Was it not equivalent to teaching some tuition fees just to be a tool? If there was effort, there would be gains. This was already a rare and precious gift. If anyone wanted to force him to come, they might as well not come. It would be a waste of time to come. Therefore, when Shay proposed cooperation, he directly ignored his position as an alchemist and hit it off. Apart from that, there is one more thing I need to inform you. Shay's expression became serious. The inference about the destruction element, the beast of eternal life, is correct. Gulialu's 9 heads lifted. It was as if he was frowning. Chapter 357. The message in Shah's words was very serious. But for him, it was a great advantage. If this witch's night contained the mystery of the beast of eternal life in addition to the rancher, it was a good thing that was worth an alchemist risking his life for. It was a gain. It was a gain to be here, and it was not a loss to be able to take a look and leave. But the problem was that the more elements of destruction involved, the more dangerous the situation inside the witch's night would be. In these short 8 hours, there was no doubt that a long time had passed. Even Gulialu, who had a smooth journey, had experienced a lot of danger, let alone others. Furthermore, there was a possibility that it might be contaminated if the depth inside kept increasing. Even Gulialu was not sure if he had the courage to persist until the end. If you ask me, you need to add more fuel, Shah said. If I'm not wrong, the exam has just begun. The time before this is just the last mercy that the predecessor left for us to seize the opportunity to read the book. Gulialu did not speak. As Shah had said, if this Night of the Witch was an examination, then the one who would set the questions would undoubtedly be the deceased creator. The creators who came to reclaim the legacy of this predecessor were the candidates who participated in the exam, and the explorers who seemed to be in the limelight on the stage were just the answers written by the creators. There could be many answers, but in the end, there could only be one correct answer. Even now, Gulialu had not figured out what the question was. Shah seemed to have some vague ideas, but he said nothing. This guy seemed casual, but in fact, he was the tightest of all the creators who participated in the exam. No matter how unreliable he was still the youngest creator in the last 100 years. It was impossible for him to not have some shrewdness. Don't worry, I have full confidence in you. After all, it is my work. It can't be too far behind Niflheim's 6-winged phoenix, Kinjertai's Taurus, and Nakajima's desolate Guzzin. Our progress is the fastest among all of them. What about the Eternal Titan Empire you mentioned a few days ago? Ah, that's a stupid name. And an individual group and a group are two different things. The members are different. There is no analogy. Sha shook his head and sighed. But compared to a powerful individual, how to survive in hell as a group seems to be more challenging. If I had known that there was such a fun thing, I might have participated. Unfortunately, I drew the lot too late and missed 3 good cards in a row. I'm so angry. 3 cards? Gulielu asked. He was not too angry about the fact that he was actually a substitute. Rather, it would be strange if a creator sought cooperation from an alchemist like himself. He was just curious who his competitors were. In this regard, Sha was very straightforward in admitting it. Apart from the Eternal Titan Empire, there are 2 people I'm. The first one is an ordinary person who came in by accident. He should have been kicked out very quickly. I originally wanted to help her, but after she was chosen by another creator, she actually showed talent in some aspects that I didn't expect. This is too frustrating, especially since I've always been quite confident in my own talent as a teacher. I've really misjudged you. What about the other one? The other one. Sha's expression suddenly became a little strange. The other one is a gold medal military officer who has been internally evaluated as S-class by the Directorate of Command. Although he is a little weak now, he is definitely not lacking in character and ability. Moreover, he seems to have the support of some old seniors in the Utopia. He has a promising future, and his performance in the early stages was simply amazing. It was simply, full of novelty. Sha sighed. This kind of talent is full of experience in fighting. The few of us were about to fall out with each other when we fought over him. In the end, when the remains transformed, he went straight to another creator, someone we don't know. Ha ha, you don't know, but Niflheim's face turned green at that time. Do you want to see it? I even took a picture. Take a look. He excitedly wanted to show his gains to Gulielu, but he was coldly rejected. There were some jokes that Sheikh could make, but whether the others were qualified to listen to them or not was another matter. Gulielu was quite self-aware about this and did not want to get involved in the mess in the continuation court. Anyway, congratulations on completing the god transformation. Sha threw away the tablet in his hand and congratulated with a smile. You have become the second explorer to get a ticket. Gulielu was stunned for a moment, and his 9 huge heads lifted up in disbelief. He finally felt disappointment and anger. He could not accept it. What's going on? As an uncontrollable chill spread, Hydra's scarlet eyes widened. How can there be someone faster than me? Probably because there is someone crazier than you. Sha spread his hands regretfully. Although your god transformation started earlier, you were a full half an hour later than him. It's a pity that you are not destined to be first. Sha could not help but turn back and look at the shattered land thousands of miles behind him. He could not help but sigh softly. I told you earlier, that's a really good card. 45 minutes ago, at the moment when Huaishur was engulfed by the bloody light. In the 5 cities, all the giant beasts felt a burst of panic from the bottom of their hearts. It was an instinctive fear, just like the ride of rats before an earthquake. They felt as if there was a knife at their back. They turned back in disbelief and saw the bloody tornado slowly rising against the sky. The frenzied bloody color danced in this gray world and spread violently. The roars of thousands of people turned into a solemn hymn. The sacred song echoed in everyone's ears. It was an indisputable, solemn melody, but also carried deep-rooted resentment and unwillingness. When countless pale souls soared into the sky, everyone was drowned in an overwhelming chill. Countless eyes looked hungrily at all the living creatures within sight. Hungry run. They had to run away. Otherwise, it would be too late. They ran with all their might in a disheveled, quick, and desperate manner. Regardless of whether they were fighting or tired, at this moment, they had already begun to run wildly in fear and resentment that did not need to be explained. The giant beasts, who used to be insufferably arrogant, were now fleeing with their hands covering their heads. What was faster than them was the endless torrent of souls. 110,000 lizardmen's souls, who had been tortured by the abyss at this moment, in the solemn hymn, like a group of demons descending on Judgment Day, launched a desperate attack on all the living creatures. The white souls filled the sky like a flood, setting off layers of ripples. Then, a torrential rain of resentment fell from the sky. Just like a colony of ants hunting for food, the souls covered every inch of the giant beast's skin and even drilled into their mouths and noses, nibbling away all their rationality. Soon, they broke out of their abdomens with a thick, bloody aura, wrapped in wisps of scarlet blood, and returned to the bloody tornado. Only a few giant beasts reacted quickly and escaped this disaster. When they finally stopped in a safe area and looked back, they saw countless viscous bloody colors spreading out from the crimson storm like limbs, shrouding the rest of the cities. It was as if the end of the world had finally come. The funny thing was, before everything ushered in the destruction of the end of the world, everything was about to be destroyed by themselves. Countless viscous bloody colors were pulled by the gravitational force of the storm and constantly flew up, like thousands of raindrops flying into the sky. All life was devoured by the bloody storm that turned into ferocious beasts. However, it was still not enough. In the storm, countless souls were solemnly singing hymns. All of a sudden, a bloody torrent swept out and pierced into the city, tearing the layers of palaces apart. In the end, it brought a skull that looked like it was made of iron and stone back into the bloody storm. F***CK, our god's remains. The giant beasts that were lucky enough to survive were dumbstruck. But right after that, they saw the blood-red torrent descending one after another. The hungry wild beasts violently smashed the checkpoints of the city walls and dragged countless corpses into the torrent. The gods' remains that were hidden in the deepest part of the country were dragged into the storm by the bloody torrent. The bloody torrent that danced between heaven and earth became even more frenzied. The solemn hymns filled heaven and earth. Finally, the world was enraged. All of a sudden, the sky shattered. Like an iron curtain that was smashed from the outside, intense light shot out from the countless cracks, bringing with it terrifying heat. Subsequently, pitch-black clouds gathered together with a rapidly decreasing depth index. In the clouds of death that were condensed from layers of abysses, violent lightning brewed like angry snakes moving in ink. A horrifying natural disaster was brewing. Meanwhile, the absolute malice had already locked onto the bloody storm. Thick lightning kept jumping in the clouds, galloping in the majestic wind. Flames ignited on the ground out of nowhere, enveloping everything within sight in a terrifyingly high temperature. The dry and scorching hurricane swept across, bringing with it the heat of an oven and the ferocious poison that could kill all living things. Sedimentation tide, faint wind, and nameless fire. The existence that was originally just an ordinary abyssal phenomenon had now expanded to the range of a jaw-dropping disaster as the depth index deepened crazily. It was enough to turn the entire city into ashes in an instant. There was no doubt that intense malice had descended here. When Huaishur opened his eyes, he finally caught a glimpse of the endless lightning that almost occupied the entire sky through the bloody storm. F***. The terrifying light that was enough to burn an ordinary person's eyes was reflected in his vertical pupils. He could not help but open his mouth in shock. Which fellow cultivator is undergoing the heavenly tribulation here? Soon, the enraged heavenly punishment answered this question. Countless bolts of lightning were like spears, carrying flames that would not hesitate to burn the three realms to ashes. They were aimed at Huaishur's stunned face. Ah, it's me. He finally came to a realization. Just as the sky was filled with lightning, he raised his dog head, pondered for a moment, and calmly analyzed, "Oh my God, I'm dead." At that moment, lightning fell from the sky like rain. Chapter 358. It was as if 100,000 heavenly soldiers and heavenly generals had come to his head while he was sleeping. They surrounded him in an inescapable net, waiting for a one-eyed black man with permed hair to jump out with 2 guns in his hands and shout at him, "Surprise, mother at Kerr." Now, a surprise fell from the sky. It illuminated Huaishur's pupils. He raised his head stiffly and looked up at the violent lightning in the sky, dumbfounded. Oh my God, what sin have I committed? Did I say something like, I'm going to defy the heavens in my dream again? But this was not the same as shouting hundreds of thousands of times when I was sleeping, right? Before he could shout, wait, you've hit the wrong person, the forest-like lightning fell from the dark clouds. In the almost frozen time, they stabbed Huaishi's stunned face inch by inch. The speed was so fast. Huaishir could not react at all. If there had to be a precise time, it would start when the comma between "oh my God" and "I'm dead" appeared. And in Huaishir's expectation, he would be hit the moment the word "dead" appeared, and finally turn into a piece of charcoal in the lingering sound of the word "dead." As the lingering sound lingered, he was completely cold. But in fact, he was not cold. His body temperature even rose slightly. Because at the moment when the word mother was not out of his mouth, a power more solemn and terrifying than lightning sprouted from the depths of the bloodlight. Accompanied by thousands of people's hoarse chanting, a sacred melody resounded in the void. And pure white light slowly emerged from behind Huaishir's dog head and rose. Holy, holy, holy! An invisible power distorted the air and covered its outline. However, as the tens of thousands of lightning bolts descended from the sky, a violent gravitational force burst forth from it, pulling the countless dazzling and scorching lightning bolts into it. It was like an oversized lightning rod. Not even a trace of the weak aftershock fell on Huaishir's body. After greedily devouring all the thunderbolts, it seemed to have finally completed its transformation, and its appearance emerged from the void. Huaishir turned around stiffly. His eyes widened in disbelief. What the hell is this? A pair of 24K corium gold dog eyes were illuminated by the light of the solemn hymn. It seemed to be a crystallization of pure light and lightning. It was the appearance of countless souls after they were given substance. Hundreds of thousands of souls emerged from the blood and were reborn from the land of divine remains. Then, under the fanatical faith, they formed a perfect halo. Countless radiating patterns resembling thunderbolts extended from the huge halo, its edges and corners sharp. At this moment, like the statues of gods and Buddhas in temples, a huge round of light rose from behind Huaishir and slowly rotated. It was as solemn and sacred as the sun. The fervent prayers of countless souls emerged from within, stacking together to form a song that was as vast and mighty as the truth. They are praying, they are chanting, they are praising. Praise the only Almighty in this world, the God who descended from the clouds above the mortal world, the great existence who redeemed the kingdom from hell and the end of the world. Praise Huaishir, holy, 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 the all-powerful God, the eternal Almighty, the indestructible Savior, and the invincible Holy Spirit. Holy, holy, holy. With Huaishir's tolerance and transformation, they received protection and redemption from pain and despair. Now, their souls were running in Huaishir's blood. Their consciousness was sleeping in Huaishir's soul, and their faith and reverence had turned into this flawless and solemn halo. As the halo rotated, it seemed to stir up countless heavy pivots between heaven and earth, causing all things to operate here, declaring the existence of all truth and redemption in this world. This was the last thing that all the lizard men did for their savior, an insignificant contribution and gratitude. If Huaishir really did save all of this, then all of this power would rightfully belong to Huaishir, the savior of the lizard men, the only hero in this world who was willing to carry the entire kingdom out of hell. As the halo rotated, an almost endless amount of origin substance flowed out from it, filling Huaishir's body. He felt as if he had gained an invisible organ, an extra blue bar created by the final sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of souls. Compared to his own reserves, it was more than 100 times the terrifying capacity and a completely unscientific recovery speed. Now, as Huaishir stood up, the blood-red storm quietly dissipated. It was as if the red dust had been blown away by a hurricane. From the depths of the darkness, a ferocious silhouette that was completely different from the past finally appeared. The remaining lightning poured down from the sky, but did not dare to touch his figure. It only flashed for a moment, illuminating the figure standing in the blood-red storm. Ah, I'm still more used to my current state. Huaisher slowly raised his hands in front of him, staring at the clear cross as he grinned. As the hurricane swept past, the two arms on his back also slowly spread out, stretching his waist to his heart's content. His upper body was covered in layers of scarlet scales and shells, as if it was covered in armor, looking extremely ferocious. His lower body still maintained the ferocious appearance of a wolf beast. His four thick legs had sharp claws, and his long, sharp tail swayed freely, creating streaks of sparks as it rubbed against the broken ground. As he raised his head, the four curved horns on his ferocious face, which still vaguely retained the contours of his past, were aimed at the sky. Lightning jumped on them, illuminating his huge amber eyes. As Huaisher moved his body to his heart's content, the 100-meter-tall beast let out a satisfied roar, shaking the earth in the air, causing the ground to tremble in fear. A hurricane whistled in all directions, sweeping up dancing dust. Against the backdrop of the huge light wheel, all of this became so solemn, as if a myth was repeating itself. She was the new ruler of the abyss, the great being of the abyss. Huaisher was now the leader of a large group, the supreme god of the night of the witches. As such, he arrogantly raised 4 middle fingers at the sky, which was still full of malice. For time's the disdain. Come and mess with me again. Above the sky, which was full of cracks, there was a burst of angry thunder again. As the dark clouds suddenly retreated, a huge crack slowly opened up. The scorching sun, which was like a huge eye, hung high in the sky, looking down, sprinkling a vicious light. The rays that could destroy everything instantly covered the earth. But for the new Huaisher, it was like a breeze, not worth mentioning. Then in the huge eye, a glaring flame lit up. A blazing light fell from the sky, bringing with it a terrifying power that could turn all things in the world into ashes, descending into the mortal world. In an instant, the air emitted layers of winds. As if another sun had descended into the mortal world, the ferocious temperature instantly evaporated everything. And as Huaisher raised his hand, the spear, which seemed to be condensed from the scorching sun, came to an abrupt stop in front of him. The scales were instantly burned red, making sizzling sounds. But as one arm after another was placed on it, it gradually let out a whine, unable to bear the burden. In the end, under the efforts of the 4 arms, it was cleanly broken into 2. It was like forcibly breaking a nuclear bomb. The moment the crack appeared, the structure that formed the dense crystal completely collapsed, and the energy contained in it poured out without reservation. The exterminating heat burst out together with the flames, engulfing everything. The earth shook, and the wind swept through. The ruins of the mountain and the city were torn apart layer by layer, forming a deep depression. And in the scorched depression, a heavy mushroom cloud slowly rose. Soon, the mushroom cloud was cleanly torn apart. The scorched outline was revealed. Countless scales and shells were burned to charcoal, quickly falling off, and then quickly recovering along with the scorched shell, returning to its original state. In the end, the savage head of the dragon wolf slowly raised, grinned, and asked curiously towards the sky. Just this. No one responded. Only an increasingly heavy malice slowly condensed in the huge eye in the sky. Huaisher slowly lowered his head. In his hand, the slender sacrificial blade once again revealed its outline as the origin substance surged. Beautiful carvings and golden decorations quickly appeared under the nourishment of blood chi. But then, he couldn't help but shake his head. Something was missing. It was too light. The sacrificial blade dissipated, and in its place was the spear of compassion, which was now hundreds of meters long, but still felt too light. Even the weight of the axe of fury made it difficult for this excessively large body to interest. In the end, Huaisher took a deep breath and slowly raised his hand. He allowed the memories of the countless spirits to flow through his blood. Then, the high-pitched sound of steel rubbing against each other resounded between heaven and earth. Just as he opened his 5 fingers, a ray of iron light burst forth, grew, and multiplied. If pain was condensed into iron, then at this moment, in Huaishi's soul, all the pain and suffering that the lizardmen had once guarded would be enough to forge the toughest weapon in the world. When layers of lightning covered it, from the dazzling flames, a pitch-black heavy piece of iron slowly appeared on the slender hilt that he was now holding with both hands. It had scales unique to warm-blooded animals and barbs and patterns that had been left behind by the distortion. Just by looking at it, one could feel waves of hallucinatory stabbing pain. A heavy iron hammer appeared under the power of the hand of confinement. This was the testimony of the countless spirits suffering, condensed from blood and tears under the ravages of the apocalypse. The hammer of pain. At that moment, Huaishir grinned, looked up at the sky, and stared at the huge eye. Then feel it, the power of pain. The earth wailed and trembled. Layers of cracks spread out. At present, the terrifying monster that could be called Bichimos had already leapt towards the sky, trampling on gravity and common sense, tearing apart the hurricane with a violent force that was completely unreasonable. In the blink of an eye, it had already rushed to the highest point of the sky. That crack in the sky that resembled a huge eye was right in front of it. Facing the eye, Huaishir raised the big hammer in his hand. At the tail end of the huge and heavy hammer, cracks suddenly opened, erupting with plasma flames condensed from thunderbolts. For example, pain. After a long period of torment, at the moment of weakness when it could no longer bear the burden, it instantly erupted like a volcano. The disintegration of the origin substance produced a fleeting and terrifying explosion, bringing unimaginable speed to the dancing hammer. Then, the pain and despair of all the lizard men turned into a tangible weight that descended upon the huge eye. Boom! Countless amounts of blood-like lava sprinkled down from the sky, forming a rain of destruction that completely burned the earth. Amidst the rumbling, Bichimos landed on the ground and slowly raised its head. It looked up at the crack above its head that was gradually closing. As though it had truly felt pain, heavenly punishment fled from the mortal world in a sorry state. And before that, the giant eye's pupil had already been torn apart by the sudden pain. Huaishir had blasted it apart with a single strike of his hammer. Chapter 359. He, Tue. Huaishir waved his hand and dispersed the hammer of pain. He just casually spat and coldly expressed his disdain. Just average. As the lava and blood rain fell, there was no longer any trace of the giant eye in the gray sky. Between the desolate heaven and earth, only ashes were left floating in the wind. The ashes fell between the collapsed mountain peaks and the ruins, and no one could be seen anymore. There was only the present Huaishir and a crystal lizard that slowly crawled out from the soil that had been burned into turbid crystals. Jonathan. He was simply a scourge that lived for 1,000 years. This guy had been paying attention to the changes in the values of the gods' remains the entire time, constantly transmitting his first-hand observations to the outside world. He was courting death as if he was doing a live broadcast on the battlefield. In the end, he actually did not die in the turmoil. Amazing. Huaishir widened his eyes in astonishment. Why are you still alive? Before I get the research data, I won't die no matter what. Jonathan panted heavily, and the lower half of his body pulled out of the soil with difficulty. It was as if it had been crushed by something under the violent geological movement. As early as the first moment when the situation was not right, he directly used his talent and skills to drill into the soil. He drilled at least 2 to 3 kilometers down, and along the way, he could feel the continuous roaring behind him. He could feel the terrifying heat from above, even underground, as if it was going to destroy the world. Relying on the magnetic field of a mineral vein to conceal his existence, Jonathan was able to successfully survive until the end. Then, He sighed regretfully. I'm going to leave. The higher-ups sent a message, asking the scholars who did not produce any results to retreat urgently, as if there is some danger behind. But in fact, the ones who have to leave are just unlucky people like me who have not been able to carry out any research at all. Jonathan shook his head. But thanks to you, I finally got the data of the apotheosis transformation and a lot of new laws. It's enough to write a few papers. It's not a loss. He paused for a moment and opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but he hesitated. What's the matter? Huaisher looked at him in confusion. Jonathan opened his mouth several times, but in the end, he lowered his head in frustration and cursed. I'm sorry, he said. I'm really sorry. All of a sudden, he blurted out such a sentence out of nowhere. He disappeared on the spot and left the stage. Huaisher was stunned for a long time, not knowing what he was talking about. Could it be that he finally found his conscience and felt sorry for making Huaisher a tool for too long? It was really confusing. He raised his sharp claws and scratched his head. Scales rubbed against each other, and fire burst forth. Now that I can finally touch it, I feel exceptionally at ease. However, he was not used to the fact that there was always a circle of light behind him that looked like a large searchlight. This made him miss the Halo remote control in the theme park. If only it could be controlled. Soon, Huaisher discovered that this thing seemed to be controllable. Not only could the brightness be controlled by Huaisher, but it could also appear and disappear according to Huaisher's will. The color could also be highly customized. Huaisher was having so much fun that he only stopped when his backlight turned into a high-frequency, flashing, colorful RGB light pollution. It felt like he was carrying a computer case. It was too exciting. Huaisher looked around happily. After making sure that there was nothing worth staying for, he nodded and said, Fu-yi, let's go. In the silence, no one responded. Only a small stone rolled down from the ruins, making a bleak echo. Huaisher froze in place for a long time, and then smiled dryly. It seems that you're really leaving, Huaisher smiled bitterly. He couldn't help but miss her. But soon, he began to reflect on himself. When there was danger, he turned hostile and drove her away. When there was no danger, he felt a little lonely and began to call her good brother. Was it too much? But no matter what, he was afraid that he would have to travel alone for the rest of the journey. He stood there in silence for a long time. Then, he bent down and picked up the iron ball that Fu-yi used to live in from the ruins and dust. He licked it a few times and carefully smoothed out the cracks with his saliva, completing the repair. Finally, he strung it with the rope of sorrow and hung it around his neck again. The broken pieces of iron swayed inside, making a crisp sound, just like a bell. Let's go, my friend. He reached out and touched the bell, then stepped forward, embarking on the unknown journey ahead. Under the pale light, with a message notification sound, a new message appeared on the huge projection screen again. With the observation of hundreds of psionic probes, what happened during the Night of the Witch was constantly being summarized in this huge venue. Except for hundreds of scholars who were busy working, there were only a few people in the most important high-level seats. Except for Niflheim, who liked to do everything by himself and was prone to overwork, the other creators basically came here through projections. It seemed that they were working hard, but after so many years, everyone was so familiar with each other. How could they not know that a few people were slacking in the dark? The old creator whose long beard almost reached his chest, Niflheim, nodded after reading the latest news. He picked up the internal phone and ordered, "Let Jonathan rest first. I already know everything else. Also, from today onwards, adjust his internal sequence to the beta group. His papers and all research data are classified as confidential, level C, and his resume is transferred to the 6th database." The phone hung up. So cautious? The one who spoke was the creator, Nakajima, who had been paying attention to the scene. Isn't the 6th database a little too nervous? His projection seemed to have the characteristics of Ingzhou, and he was dressed like an elegant minister. But in fact, it was true. Before joining the Continuation Academy, he was indeed the last son of the noble Minamoto, but his academic focus made him give up inheriting the family name. Sometimes scholars were such indifferent existences. Once he officially entered the Continuation Academy, everything in the past would no longer have anything to do with him. Even if Ingzhou immediately sank now, without the rescue order from the Astronomical Association, he would probably be too lazy to care. Hearing Nakajima's question, Niflheim was silent for a moment before he said, "If the relevant theory continues to be studied, it will be about 2 generations later that it will be close to the immune system research of the beast of eternal life. This is a necessary protection." I'm back. What are you guys talking about behind my back?" Shay's projection suddenly appeared and frivolously broke the originally serious atmosphere. He looked around and said, "Everyone is so serious. Is there a problem?" Niflheim glanced at him indifferently and was too lazy to speak. The reason for the progress being behind? Understandable, understandable. Shay waved his hand indifferently. Look on the bright side. At least Nakajima's inference has been confirmed, right? As he spoke, he transmitted the comparison results of the 2 completely different observation records to the projection screen. The phenomenon of the deification transformation will indeed cause the overall depth index of the Night of the Witch to decrease. In other words, the more times the deification transformation is used, the more serious the hellization inside this virtual world will be. He paused for a moment and scratched his head. Although it's not clear at present whether it's because the decrease in the depth index stimulated the transformation or because the transformation caused the Doomsday deification depth index to deepen again, the 2 can already be regarded as an inevitable relationship. The relevant inference and the consequences it could cause had been submitted in the analysis room below as soon as possible. After a short discussion, another creator came online. Just by looking at him, he looked like a warrior. Not only was he burly, but his skin was also dark. His eyes were like copper bells, and his face was full of black whiskers that stood up like steel needles. It made people calm down before they wanted to talk to him. They were afraid that a fist as big as a casserole would come crashing over, and they would be in trouble. Creator King Girtai. It was said that before he was 40 years old, he was the best shepherd in the entire Mongolian region. He raised 17 dogs, and his favorite hobby was to run to the mountains with a gun after drinking wine to hunt wolves. It was not until he was 43 years old that he went into the city to buy 2 advanced mathematics books from a second-hand bookstall. From then on, he was unstoppable. At the age of 46, he became a molecular materials science scholar, and at the age of 53, he became a creator. His speed was as fast as a rocket. If it weren't for the fact that he was a late bloomer, Shay wouldn't have been the youngest creator. At this moment, as soon as he came online, he submitted his new results. The mechanism of heavenly punishment has taken shape. He adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses that didn't match his style at all and explained excitedly. If you ignore the external appearance, this is actually a very delicate design, similar to the divine retribution program of the Rainbow Bridge. However, it doesn't need the great Zarathustra to provide power. Instead, it relies on the changes in the depth index and the law of expansion formed during the diffusion process of entropy to cleverly obtain the power to inflict disasters on the Earth. In short, the creator of the Night of the Witch installed a converter between the depth index and thermodynamics in an exquisite way. The higher the depth, the stronger the heat that can be extracted by this set of laws. And during the transformation of deification, the local index deepens and directly triggers this module, forming the effect of heavenly punishment. He quickly disassembled the laws and sighed. I have to say, this technique is too delicate. Under such a bold and unconstrained structure, to be able to achieve such precise details is really an eye-opener. But the question is, why? Another creator asked, what is the purpose of this module? You can't torture people for nothing, right? King Girtai shrugged. I don't know. You ask me, I don't know. In fact, he was also confused about the purpose of this module. There was no need to make such a setting at all. If it was added because of boredom, it would be too ridiculous. If not necessary, don't add entities. Razor's law applied to the research of any scholar. Not to mention that this was a huge project that involved the whole body. Not only would it add variables, but there was also the possibility of it getting out of control. It can't be for fun, right? I think this is more like an appetizer. In the silence, Shay suddenly laughed. Look, it's clearly like an examiner throwing a big question directly at the front of the paper during an exam. In this way, in the simplest and most straightforward way, the creator showed a harsh attitude to his juniors. Shay said with a faint smile, "If you can't even pass a test of this level, then don't bother and embarrass yourself any longer. Just get out of here." Although the creator of the utopia did not exclude the astronomer from taking back his achievements, he did not mind giving these juniors a hard time. It would be better if he could make things difficult for them. Where did this workplace bullying come from? Nakajima pinched his beard, and his expression changed. In the end, he could not help but shake his head. Forget it. Since the company organized to see the cherry blossoms, wouldn't the juniors have to stay up late in advance to get a spot in the park? Bear with it. Senpai has a bad temper. What else can you do? Everyone looked at each other and shook their heads with bitter smiles. Then, spread the news and let the integration team pay attention. Niflheim, who was in charge of the overall situation, issued a new order. Double the number of probes in the observation team. Issue new permissions and orders to the internal exploration team. Don't miss any changes. Following the creator's order, hundreds of new spiritual avatars came online from the outer light tracks, and the explorers in the internal testing began to get busy. Everyone knew that the Night of the Witch was about to enter its final stage, but no one knew how many obstacles there would be before the final answer surfaced from the darkness. Only on the big screen in the venue, the list was quietly refreshed. After number 2 Hydra Gulyalu, a new name appeared. Number 3 Bichimo's Huaishur. Chapter 360. This world was going to be over. Huaishur realized this for the first time. He looked up and saw the snowflakes falling from the sky and landing on his nose. Soon, it was covered with a layer of ash. It was a tiny dust that was difficult to see with the naked eye. There were pitch-black snowflakes. Since a week ago, black snow had been falling from the sky, and it had continued to fall until now. It was like the ashes of something that had been burnt out, until everything was completely covered. It was like adding soil to the coffin after a funeral, burying everything in a leisurely manner. Now that Huaishur looked up, she could see that under the pale white sky, the ground had turned pitch black. Above the pitch-black earth, a dense fog slowly rose in spirals. There was a faint laughter behind him. Huaishur was not surprised and continued to walk forward, following the direction of the wind. Beside him, the vague outline of a village appeared in the fog. In the gentle light of the fire, a blurry figure waved at him, indicating for him to come closer. Huaishur looked back. The fog whined, shattered, and the illusion dissipated. He had seen too many such illusions in the past 2 days. After the whole world was covered with ashes, it seemed to have completely turned into this unpleasant scene. Everywhere seemed to be a strange trap and cage, waiting for people to fall into the trap. Then they were run over by Huaishur. Not a single tile was left, but there seemed to be a lot of people who were run over like this. As she advanced, Huaishur's footsteps came to a halt. She saw the huge ravines around her, as well as the deep imprints. When he climbed to the top of the mountain ridge and looked down, he saw that the gullies, which were several meters deep, were actually filled with regular marks, just like huge wheel ruts. But even the ruts were a little too huge. It was as if a city had installed caterpillar tracks and wheels on itself and was slowly passing by. Against the gale, it was heading south. Huaishur tried to look up at the ruts, but he saw nothing. Obviously, they had passed through here for a long time. But even the endless black snow could not drown out the traces they left behind. After discovering this, Huaishur didn't know why he suddenly felt a little happy. Even the signs of destruction could not erase the traces of its former existence. There had to be something left behind. Even if it was just wreckage and ruins, it would be fine. That was proof of the existence of life. He continued on his journey, the wind blowing behind him. In any case, There were no more main quests for him to do. It was as if he was wandering around in a sandbox game after clearing the game. He was aimless. He had been walking in this direction for the past week because a week ago, when the black snow fell, the wind began to blow. At first, the distance was very far, so he couldn't feel any airflow. However, the closer he got to the direction of the airflow, the fiercer the wind became. Black snow filled the sky, making it impossible to see the road ahead. He wanted to know where the wind was blowing. Since he had nothing to do, why not do some exercise? Therefore, Huaishir decisively went on the road. Once he left, he walked for a week. After seeing the marks of the ruts, he walked forward again. In the end, the wind behind him was like a natural disaster. Huge stones were constantly flying and being swept into the air. Huaishir continued to move forward as if nothing had happened. Like a planetary engine in a certain work, he would gnaw on stones when he was hungry. It was crunchy and filling. Now he could dig a hole from one side of the mountain to the other side of the mountain for a meal. Eating a meal would take a long time, but in fact, it seemed that there was no problem if he didn't eat. If he was thirsty, he didn't know what to do if he was thirsty. Because recently, water was really getting harder and harder to find. However, after he drank an entire lake in one breath last time, he never felt thirsty again. He didn't feel dry at all, and his body was getting bigger and bigger. In the end, he had lost his sense of his body size. The wind couldn't move him at all. He was like a small mountain. The highest mountain range around him seemed to be the height of a wall. He could climb over it with just a few steps. He didn't see anything bigger than himself. With every step he took, the earth rumbled. Many hills collapsed on themselves when he got close. More often than not, he had to be careful and be careful. Otherwise, he would sink into the ground. Isn't this a little too unscientific? Huaishir turned around and asked the singing spirits on the back of the mountain of light, "Will I break through the atmosphere in the end?" But then again, do you guys even have an atmosphere here? The sky is infinitely high. You don't even have the concept of outer space. Holy, the spirits of the lizard men praised in unison. Huaishir scratched his head and asked, "Do you have any clues?" Holy, the dead all praised him passionately. Huaishir's dog head twitched. He couldn't help but sigh. Can you say anything other than holy? Holy, holy, holy. The spirits on the back of the mountain of light sang even more fervently, as if they had been inspired by Huaishir. Huaishir felt extremely powerless. Fine, you can keep singing. You can even use it as background music, right? At this point, all of the lizardmen's consciousness and spirits were contained within Huaishir's body. Their origin substances were flowing through Huaishir's blood. In short, Huaishir was like a small box that contained the lizardmen's final consciousness. Even though this analogy was a bit strange, it wasn't wrong. Their consciousnesses were currently sleeping within Huaishir's bones, and their remaining instincts and beliefs had transformed into a ring of light that constantly praised Huaishir's holiness and greatness. Hoping that they would respond was too much of fantasy. Just singing for him was already pretty good. At least there was some sound, so he wasn't too lonely. Huaishir continued to listen to the lizardman's song on repeat as he continued to walk forward. In the end, he finally stopped. He raised his head and stared at the sky in the distance. Okay, he finally knew where the wind was coming from. There was a large hole in the sky. All of the air was flowing out of the huge hole, disappearing into the unknown darkness. Huaishir tried to throw a piece of metal in that direction, but when the piece of metal flew into it, it quickly dissipated. In the end, the only thing that came back was an extreme emptiness and coldness. It was impossible for anything to exist in that space. It could be expected that if the air continued to flow out at this speed, the entire world would soon become a vacuum. Just as he stood there scratching his head, he saw specks of light shining through the layers of black snow in the sky. The stars seemed to have become a bit bigger. Then they became a bit bigger and a bit bigger. In the end, Huaishir finally reacted and opened his eyes wide in shock. He finally understood. The stars were falling. 4 days later, the burning six-winged, undying bird descended from the sky and landed on the dry desert. It saw the Hydra waiting here. Didn't you say you were waiting for me at the seaside? The undying bird asked in confusion. That's what I said. The Hydra's 9 heads replied expressionlessly. 2 days ago, this was the seaside. The undying bird was silent for a long time and asked with a dry voice, Where's the thing you wanted to show me? Follow me. The Hydra turned its huge body and walked slowly towards the depths of the dry ocean. They walked forward for 3 days and then stopped in front of the huge steel mountain. The rough piece of black iron fell from the sky, smashing the skeleton of a whale and then crushing countless barnacles and corals. After leaving a deep trench on the seabed, it was wedged deep into the broken seabed. On the huge iron block, there were still traces of blue flames burning slowly, like a candle in the wind. Didn't you want to see the falling stars? The Hydra lifted the tip of its tail and pointed, and said to the undying bird's ugly face, This is it. In the distance, in the dry desert-like seabed, countless large and small iron blocks had sunk into the sand, and the once majestic and glorious appearance could no longer be seen. This was the final destination of the stars. Gather, everyone. After a long silence, the 6-winged, undying bird spread its huge wings and soared into the sky. This is not something that can be solved by one person. Huaishur stood in the middle of the black snow that had stopped falling. This should be the edge of the country of fog, the place where he was immersed in the illusion. He even played Fight the Landlord here with 2 brothers who came from nowhere. But now, there was nothing left here. There was only dead silence. In the deepest part of the dissipating fog, Huaishur found a few skeletons snuggling together. Before the end of the world, they had already fallen asleep in each other's arms. They were free from fear and despair. Huaishur stood there in a daze for a long, long time. He lifted the tip of his tail and dug a pit for them. He carefully put them in there and covered them with soil. Because he did not know their names, Huaishur did not even know how to set up a tombstone for them. I originally wanted to bring you with me. Huaishur scratched his head, sighed gloomily, and turned to leave. After taking a few steps, he turned back and sincerely thanked them. Thank you for the stew. No one responded. In the spiraling fog, the old outline of the cat, grandmother, seemed to appear. She waved at him and disappeared again. Huaishur did not know where he could go. The whole world seemed to be ending. Along the way, he did not see anything alive at all. He could only find decay and distortion in the increasingly serious depth index. The whole world was slowly dying, as if it had really become the world after death. It had become hell. And just as Huaishur was deep in thought, he felt the sky above his head tremble slightly. He thought it was an illusion. The sky trembled again. When he looked up, he saw that in the center of the sky, the light of the big fireball was rapidly diminishing. Like an old light bulb, it struggled to flash twice. It was extinguished. The world fell into darkness. The sun was gone. Huaishur opened his mouth in a daze. He began to feel lucky that he still had a huge light bulb with him. Chapter 361. At this moment, as the sun went out, Shay's projection in the hall slowly turned around and looked at his colleagues with a faint smile. Now, no one doubts my previous inference, right? Your previous inference? Nakajima's face twitched, and he asked, Which of the 1,200 inferences you submitted earlier are you referring to? The one about the man-eating flower cross-species mating? Be serious, my friend. Shay's expression became serious. You know which one I'm talking about. So, next time, can you be more straightforward and announce in advance when you decide to announce a new discovery? Niflheim glanced at this guy and emphasized, at least you shouldn't put important inferences in a pile of insignificant things. Aren't I just bringing a little surprise to everyone? Shay shrugged. Anyway, even he himself did not know how many of his 1,200 inferences were correct and reliable. In any case, the man-eating flower cross-species mating was definitely not reliable. And now, no matter how confused the creator was, he should be able to see the question on the test paper clearly. This was the theme of the Witch's Night. Survival and survival in the end of the world. Wasn't the reason why the explorers were given so much time in advance to prepare for the arrival of this moment? If before, it was time to raise an army for 1,000 days, now should be the time to go to war. What kind of life form, what kind of existence, what kind of species, and what kind of social structure could survive in such a bad situation for a long time? Evolving in the abyss was to not perish in the abyss. So now, destruction was coming. Who would be the one to continue living? No one was sure. It was like locking the ascendants in a border, then cutting a wedge and sinking the border bit by bit into the bottom of the abyss. There was nowhere to escape. How to live longer. This was the essence of this doomsday evolution theory. There were no nuclear bombs, no zombies, and even no indescribable monsters. There was only a world that gradually withered and gradually fell into the depths of death. Everyone who was contained in this iron box would feel a wave of fear and uneasiness. Actually, I have a suggestion, Nakajima said. Kinjelt nodded. I have one too. Sha shrugged. I don't care. Niflheim was silent for a long time and nodded slightly. So, all the research groups will give up their independence and start to gather? This was the most reliable solution at the moment. No matter what happens next, let's gather together and work together. One more dog could guard the door. But the problem is, Shay suddenly asked, who will be the leader? There could be many ways, but it was worth considering which one would be the final one. Even if they worked together, it was impossible to realize everyone's ideas. Otherwise, no matter how scattered the manpower was, it would be better for everyone to do things their own way. No one spoke. Obviously, everyone felt that this person should be him. Only Niflheim sneered. It doesn't matter who is willing to make the decision. The old creator glanced at Shay, who was trying his best to cause trouble for him. You speak as if we have any other effective measures now. Sha's smile remained unchanged, as if he didn't know what Sha was thinking. She didn't seem like the person who was always causing trouble. But Niflheim wasn't wrong, and she knew this better than anyone else. In the beginning, they could still guide their agents step by step to implement their plans. But now, the bets have been placed. There is only the principle of making a bet and leaving. How could there be room for tactical micromanipulation, blindly commanding across the entire world and letting the people below advance the battle line by 50 meters? Are you kidding? Isn't this suicide? Besides, the exploration team below were all elites, and none of them were to be trifled with. They would only be more knowledgeable about crisis countermeasures and measures than scholars like them. Life wasn't easy to begin with, and if they were to be commanded by the higher-ups, how could they still play? The moment the transformation from deification was completed, their work was equivalent to being completed. The answer had already fallen on the paper. Now that the paper was collected, could you still say sorry to the examiner? I don't think this answer is very appropriate. Let me change it. Dream on. Now, the main body had become the explorers who were struggling to survive inside. More than 400 scholars and other participants added up to more than 1,000 people. These more than 1,000 people could almost be equivalent to covering most of the technology mastered by the entire realm. In other words, excluding other safety measures, it could almost be regarded as a pocket version of the realm that was tens of thousands of times smaller. They could also implement most of the measures that the realm could take in the face of crisis, and they could ensure perfection on a small scale. Of course, with a creator behind them. They could get more help, but in this case, the painstaking efforts of the deceased creator would be completely in vain. Don't you understand it yet? Niflheim glanced at other colleagues. This is not a study of the abyss theory of evolution, but an opportunity given to the realm by the predecessor. An exercise to test all countermeasures against the apocalypse. Turn the entire night of the witch into hell, integrate the elements of destruction, and become the sandbox of the apocalypse. This was the last gift that the old man left for the realm. It was a limited but still very precious exercise. Or rather, a mockery from the former utopia. When destruction comes, can the conservatism that you are so proud of continue to maintain this world? To be honest, I'm looking forward to the final outcome. Niflheim's fingers tapped on the table as he stared quietly at the big screen. It's like the predecessor is looking forward to us. In the darkness, the sleeping Huaishur seemed to hear a plane flying past in the sky. He thought it was an illusion, and then another one flew past. The dog head frowned, turned around, raised the aperture behind him, and aimed it at the sky. Then, it suddenly shone a rainbow-colored disco-like searchlight that polluted the mind. F*CK. Which bastard turned on the high beam? A roar came from the sky. Turn it off! Turn it off! Who is it? Huaisher raised his head and shouted. What are you doing flying around? Delivering a letter. The dog head sitting on the steam plane pulled down the handle, made a big turn in the air, and roared through the loudspeaker. Huaisher? Where is Huaisher? I passed by several times. Why didn't I see him? You're calling me? In the darkness ahead, a huge dog head slowly rose and looked at the plane that flew past like a mosquito. The dog voice was like thunder. I'm here. Oh my God, it's so big. The dog head who was flying the plane almost peed in fright. The steam plane accidentally lost control and stalled and fell. Then, Huaisher immediately raised the tip of his nail and grabbed it. He lifted it up and placed it in front of an eyeball that was half the size of a football field to carefully examine it. You're calling me? What's the matter? The dog head climbed out of the plane and tried to lift the searchlight, almost falling off Huaisher's nail. Even the special strong searchlight could not see clearly. It could only see his ears from the tip of his nose. This was already a huge scale beyond his imagination. He was halfway through swearing when he suddenly realized something. He forcibly swallowed it back into his stomach and squeezed out an awkward smile. What did you eat to grow so big? Stone. Do you want some? Crunchy? Huaisher pulled out a stone pillar from the ground and stuffed it into his mouth. It was as if he was chewing on sugarcane. Amid the crunching sounds, stone chips flew everywhere. The dog head's eyes twitched wildly, especially when he saw the exposed iron ore in the twisted stone pillar. When Huaisher closed his teeth and sparks flew, he was so scared that he almost peed himself. We're all explorers. Why are you so good at work? It was not until Huaisher finished chewing on the stone pillar and wiped his mouth that he asked, Why aren't you talking? It's a long story. The child doesn't have a mother? Huaisher tentatively added, and the dog head's expression began to twitch again. It couldn't be helped. It was really difficult to finally find someone to talk to. As if he had a premonition about Huaisher's endless stream of obscenities, the dog head said everything he wanted to say in rapid succession. The witch's night has begun to turn into an apocalypse. The astronomy committee will gather all the surviving explorers to tide over this difficulty together. If you want, you can go south from here until you can see the stars. Then, under the only star, we will set up an apocalyptic battlefront and welcome the arrival of every explorer. After saying all this in one breath, the dog head jumped back onto the plane and tried to turn the engine rotor. After the machine was restarted, he put on the windshield and waved at Huaisher. Hey, brother, let go. I still have to deliver letters to other places. Oh. Huaisher hurriedly let go of his claws. His movement was a little too big and almost threw the dog head's plane into the sky. Then, he reacted and reached out to grab the plane that had just flown back. Wait, are you shaking me? He widened his eyes. Didn't the stars all fall? Then we don't know how to launch satellites. The dog head was furious. Can you not use so much force? I'll flatten the plane for you. Okay. Huaisher awkwardly let go of her hand, and the plane fell straight down. Soon, it drew an arc with great difficulty and rose up again. After pressing its horn at Huaisher twice in annoyance, it flew off into the distance with a plume of smoke coming out of its mouth. Huaisher heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the distance. They were heading south. More planes were flying in all directions with loudspeakers and searchlights, broadcasting 24 hours a day, telling every survivor to go to the place with the stars. For some reason, Huaisher's gloomy mood improved a little. This world was not dead yet, because there were still people who had not given up. He gave a shout of pleasure, drawing out a long note in the broken silence. Brother Jeannet deserves it. Then, behind him, in the colorful RGB light pollution, hundreds of thousands of lizard men sang in unison, escorting Bichimos on his journey once again to the south. Chapter 362. There's a big guy going over. Receive him with care. 7 days ago, the goblin in charge of receiving telegrams in the Eternal Titan Empire received a signal from the border outpost. Big guy. The goblin on the iron chair looked down at the telegram and couldn't help but look out the window at the countless behemoths rumbling through the darkness. He suddenly sneered and shook his head. Who doesn't know that it's a big guy? Don't be surprised. 5 days ago, faint thunder came from the distance. The Geological Survey Center reported that a strong gravitational source had distorted the geomagnetism, causing some radars to malfunction. 3 days ago, at the end of the darkness, a ray of unbelievable light shone. Then, in the following 3 days, everyone saw a huge mountain slowly moving towards them within the sacred and solemn rainbow-colored halo. In the vacuum where the air was gradually thinning, thunder spread. It was as if a god had descended upon the mortal world. It was a pity that it looked like a disco god, no matter how one looked at it. It carried a rainbow-colored light belt with it, and gospel hymns were played on loop forever. Then 1 day ago, in the solemn disco that was played on loop forever, Bichimos raised his head and looked at the iron ball hanging high in the sky in the distance. It was still glowing with a pleasant light. That should be the satellite they were talking about. He opened his mouth and stuck out his tongue, wanted to take a bite or two. Was this thing delicious? The goblin supervisor of the telegram center had been hung upside down on the signal tower by the six-winged, undying bird. That's the big guy you were talking about. The undying bird pointed at the huge mountain rumbling forward in the distance and roared. Then what are we? Pocket-sized toys. Under the divine might, the goblin supervisor simply rolled his eyes, foamed at the mouth, and lost consciousness. Then, Huaisher saw a dot of fire rapidly enlarging in front of his eyes. Friend, wait. The flaming, undying bird landed on Huaisher's nose and flapped its wings vigorously to show its existence. Don't go any further. If you go any further, the ground below us will tilt up. It was like a seesaw. Huaisher's existence caused the entire vast plain to faintly warp. The level indicator was tilted by at least 5 degrees, and it might be even higher if they continued forward. Not only that, but all the work in the city had stopped because of Huaisher's arrival. I don't know if it's good or evil. He was almost on full alert. Then I'll stop here. Huaisher followed his advice and stopped in her tracks. The phoenix heaved a sigh of relief. He felt a little embarrassed when he told Huaisher not to go any further. He was the one who had asked her to come, but now that she was here, he had asked her to stop outside the door. Putting aside the fact that it was a matter of politeness, he shouldn't have done that. But the problem was, this tonnage was too big. Even the undying bird, which had grown rapidly after its deification, was not as big as his head. What did this big brother eat to grow up? Then, he saw Huaisher's dog head reveal a simple and honest smile. I'm a little tired from walking. Is it okay if I sit for a while? Of course. Wait. The undying bird wanted to nod out of habit, but when it remembered the quality research report submitted by the scholars below, its face immediately turned green. But by the time he wanted to stop it, it was already too late. Bichimos, who was as huge as a mountain, had adeptly lowered its forelegs. Then it sat down in the sudden burst of hurricane, lay down, and stretched its forelegs, accompanied by a roar that shook the earth and mountains. It was as if a mountain had smashed into the entire plain out of thin air. Terrifying tremors spread in all directions. Waves of air swept across. Visible to the naked eye, the steel city hundreds of kilometers away suddenly shook. It jumped more than a meter high from the flat ground and smashed into the ground again. It emitted a sharp whine of twisted metal. Oh, it seems like I've broken something. Huaisher, who finally felt that he had messed up, raised his head in astonishment and looked at the undying bird blankly. Are you all right? No, I'm fine. The undying bird swallowed a mouthful of old blood into its stomach and forced a smile. Mother Faster's cur, why is this dog so big? It was already 2 days later when Huaisher finally settled down near the city. It took him a day just to move around the city. He had to slow down his movements as much as possible to avoid causing a greater impact. Otherwise, if he stepped on it twice more, the joint city-state below would be gone. Just like that, Huaishur settled down here. It should now be called the Eternal Titan Empire Enhanced Version V3. 0. The original underground empire united several cities and races on the surface to form a new city. In addition to the original capital, four satellite cities were radiated out. With the assistance of Huaishur, the first supergiant metallurgical base was established at the foot of the mountain. In any case, Huaishur's specific job was to sit down, lie down, and not move around when there was nothing to do. When they needed him, he would spit out a mouthful of fire or saliva to help with the forging of large steel structures or other million-ton alloy equipment. In return, the city-state specially sent a team of experts to accompany Huaishur 24 hours a day and talk nonsense. It had to be said that everyone got along pretty well. In addition to the scholars, there were also many military officers and operatives among the explorers. However, the one that Huaishur got along with the most was another giant beast known as the Hydra, an alchemist who specialized in the study of origin substances. Since she had nothing else to do, Huaishur decided to make up for her metal studies. After all, she was only lacking in the basics, and she had also managed to scoop out quite a bit of origin substance knowledge from Gulyalu. I have to say, it's a waste of talent for someone like you to be in the Astronomy Society. After a day of lessons, Gulyalu sighed from the bottom of his heart. Do you want to consider developing in the Stone Cauldron Society? Huaishur was overjoyed. Am I one of those geniuses in alchemy? No, no, no. With your aptitude in alchemy, it's actually very ordinary. Although you have a lot of experience in metals and origin substances, but Gulyalu looked like he was at a loss for words. He had only used 2 lessons to figure out Huaishur's level in alchemy. He had a lot of hands-on experience, but he was lacking in theory. That was fine, but the key was Huaishur really didn't have any talent in alchemy. Giving him a recipe and letting him pick the ingredients according to the recipe was definitely not a problem. But if he wanted to improve it or something else, it would be better to talk about what they were eating tonight. Simply put, Huaishur could be a good assistant and tool, but he definitely couldn't become the leader of the workshop. Not to mention innovating the old and creating new results. Then why are you looking for me? Huaishur rolled his eyes. Because you can't fight, the Hydra said in a trembling voice. Does our Stone Cauldron Society lack alchemists? What we lack is people like you who can fight. If you're willing to join the Stone Cauldron Society, not to mention your alchemy license, with my teacher Garland's face, the Stone Cauldron Society will cover all the materials you need for stigmata in the future. Huaishur's eyes had rolled all the way to the back of his head. Wasn't this still a freaking craftsman? Even if they were both craftsmen, how could the Astronomy Society's craftsman be the same as the Stone Cauldron Society's craftsman? One was a tool to protect the realm, while the other could only sit in the gatehouse and be his staff. There was a huge difference in quality. Moreover, Huaishur was an official person, different from those contract workers who were part of the operation. Not to mention that he was a military officer who could travel through the realm and most of the borders. His military rank was at least at the rank of lieutenant. He couldn't even finish the ribbon fish distributed by the unit every year. So how could he work for others? Besides, his goal was to become a craftsman. He was an artist. Could an artist be a hired thug? What a disgrace. He completely forgot that he deserved to be struck by lightning for using his cello-playing method to hack people. Huaishur righteously rejected Hydra's poaching operation. Well, in front of the undying bird. As the creator who presided over the Night of the Witch this time, Niflheim chose the undying bird as his agent for a reason. As a retired officer of the 4 major legions of the Astronomy Society, this experienced descendant had been engaged in the development of hell for a long time after retirement. Later, he responded to the reemployment and joined the Abyss archaeological team, becoming an expert in the disposal of relics. He even survived until the age of 54. In addition to being bold, careful, and lucky, he had a lot of experience in fighting. Most importantly, he had a deep background. He could be said to be a direct descendant of the Astronomy Society and the backbone of the Command Bureau. Hearing that Huaishur was so loyal, he nodded his head in satisfaction. Young man, You can yell, "I'll make arrangements after we get out." But in the end, these were just seeking joy in the midst of bitterness. Everyone just got together to chat after being lonely for a long time. The long darkness had affected the spirit of every explorer. It was said that there were many conflicts in the city every day, but they were quickly suppressed by powerful bullets. A state of martial law. Even the giant beasts were seriously prone to violence these days, and everyone was irritable. In comparison, Huai Shi, who had a frighteningly large physique, could only speak obscene words. She was simply a model. He was so thick-skinned that even social psychology scholars had to give him a thumbs up. You're probably the kind of person who can get up early and go to bed early on time and have 3 meals a day, even if the sky falls and the earth rends. Is it that amazing? Well, some people have strong willpower, and some people, maybe it's because they're born heartless. The scholar who came to give him psychological counseling bowed his head and wrote and drew in his notebook, ticking all the boxes. To be honest, I've studied social psychology for so many years, and this is the first time I've seen someone with such an unhealthy mentality. It's a bit too amazing. Are you interested in cooperating with me for research later? As long as you're willing to cooperate with me to do a warm-up exercise. Yes, the kind where you're a target. Huai Shi grinned and used a gentle smile to dissuade every scholar who wanted to have ideas about him. After waiting for more than half a month, almost all the explorers had gathered. It was said that the temporarily assembled probe indicated that there seemed to be more places further away, but it was too late to get there. They could only send out a few explorers who had evolved races to fly through the night to inform them. On the other hand, around the name Eternal Titan Empire, which seemed to be a complete idiot, the planes were completely different from half a month ago. The dead silence of the world was broken. It was bustling with activity. Giant beasts of all sizes gathered together with the races that had rushed over from all directions and formed a new order. Other than the evolved races that had integrated into the Empire's structure, most of the giant beasts stayed in another outer city and other arranged places. Naturally, there were people who arranged work and provided food for them. Only the 16 holy beasts that had completed the deification transformation could enter the mountaintop to participate in the final decision-making meeting. It was difficult to tell whether Huai Shi had participated in the meeting as a meeting member, because he was the mountain where the meeting was held. Chapter 363. The people who presided over the meeting were the undying bird as the representative of the explorers and the fox as the representative of the scholars. The people who participated in the meeting all squatted in front of Huai Shi, and a few couldn't sit still and ran to Huai Shi's nose and horns. Due to the urgency of the situation, there was no time for fancy things like a meeting room or a Doomsday countermeasure headquarters. Everyone just needed to find a place to sit down. There wasn't even a cup of tea. The monster meeting was that simple and direct. I think everyone already understands a specific situation, so I won't say more. The six-winged, undying bird said straightforwardly, "Everyone work together and try to survive the Doomsday. This is no longer a problem that can be solved by one person. If anyone wants to fly alone, say it, and I will send him out." Once the words were spoken, everyone had no objections. At this time, those who wanted to leave the group and act on their own were definitely brainless examples. Leaving this kind of idiot was also a scourge, so it was better to simply send him away. The world was about to be destroyed, and they still had their own little plans. It was completely reckless. What's more, 80% of the people who entered here were members of the Astronomical Association and naturally belonged to the same system. At this moment, no one objected to the undying bird and the fox taking over the management rights. In addition to relying on force to survive the Doomsday, wasn't it also relying on brains? There was no way out if one went alone. They would starve to death. Well, except for Huai Shi. The reason he stayed was very simple. He just wanted to find someone to talk to. These days, he always felt lost in his heart, as if he had forgotten something, but when he thought about it carefully, he couldn't remember it. This made him feel particularly lonely. He always felt that he shouldn't be like this, but he couldn't tell what it should be. He thought he just lost something. But no matter what, he couldn't say what he lost. It could only be attributed to excessive mental pressure. It was a pity that no doctor could prescribe him any medicine, and there was no medicine large enough to be thrown into his mouth and have enough medicinal effect. 2 puffs of air came out of his nostrils gloomily, raising a cloud of dust. Then he was glared at by several approaching behemoths. He smiled awkwardly and stopped talking. His mind was wandering. For some reason, he was in a bad mood. He wasn't even interested in exploring the Witch's Night anymore. Just let it be. Anyway, it was fun to slack off. The Phoenix and the Fox had obviously made arrangements long ago. After everyone expressed their opinions, they quickly divided the responsibilities and personnel. All of the behemoths obviously had their own work to do. For example, Hydra, as one of the few alchemists here, had to maintain a deep balance in the city. He had to smoothly discharge all the abyssal sediment from the preset flood diversion channel to avoid any hidden dangers that would accumulate over a long period of time and suddenly erupt, turning all the races into erosion species. The huge flying jellyfish in the sky, Huang Yuqian, was responsible for the water supply. Except for her talent, it was difficult for the people here to produce a large amount of pure water for the city's drinking and industrial use in a short period of time. It was worth mentioning that the Taurus constellation was not present. As the creation of Gear Air Tai, the Taurus constellation turned itself into an energy creature, looking like a floating thundercloud. But now, as the world gradually became desolate, it was difficult for the Taurus constellation to maintain its shape. Like a candle in the wind, it could only live in the central reactor of the Titan Empire. As the energy director, he was responsible for managing the central reactor. With him around, at least the energy problem would not be too much to worry about in the short term. Anyway, it was not afraid of radiation. In the past 2 days, it had begun to conduct fission experiments. Presumably, it would soon be able to enter the nuclear power generation. This group of cheating scholars had already built airplanes and launched satellites in the steam age. When the time came, who knew what they would come up with? The scholars would stabilize the law in the abyss and try to maintain the depth of an area so that it would not be too exaggerated. With the help of alchemists, they would avoid distortions and strange phenomena in the gathering area. And now, the tens of millions of various evolved races in the city were their hands and feet and eyes. These species created by the explorers of the race route did not have too many distracting thoughts and desires except for their own nature. And they were 100% obedient to the orders of the patriarch, which was the best way to maintain them. Then, as the water source and energy were settled, the food was also handed over to another tree person who had completed the transformation of deification. Other crops, such as wheat, were a little troublesome, but mushrooms were enough. It was foreseeable that for a long time to come, the eternal Titan Empire would be shrouded in the shadow of mushrooms. There would be endless stir-fried mushrooms, steamed mushrooms, mushroom stew, abyssal mushroom soup. Huaishir was in the mood to talk to the tree person about cooking in a low voice. In the end, when the conversation was about to end, the tree person had already patted its chest and said, "It's a piece of cake. I'll go back and make some glowing mushrooms. The kind that will release colorful golden light when cooked. It's high-end." Presumably, the group of goblins, kobolds, and even gnomes would smile happily if they knew that they would have glowing dishes to eat every day in the future. Then he found that most of the participants had left. "That's it?" Huaishir stared at the undying bird in disbelief. The undying bird nodded. "Yes, but it's not my turn yet." Huaishir moved closer to the dog's head and opened his eyes wide. "What about mine? What about mine?" The undying bird was stunned for a moment and looked at him strangely. "You can continue to be in charge of the smelting center. Aren't you doing a good job?" Anyway, Huaishir was responsible for dozing off, drooling, and occasionally sneezing to light the fire for the largest steel-making furnace. He himself was equivalent to a complete giant steel assembly line. Now that so many scholars had come to assist him, the efficiency was naturally even more amazing. But the problem was that it was too boring. Every day he squatted in one place and dozed off. He could no longer suppress the primitive restlessness in the depths of his blood in his chest. He wanted to dismantle something. For the past 2 days, when he looked up at the city not far away, he could not help but feel a little eager to try. I think you're doing a good job. Very good. The undying bird frantically tried to dissuade him. It's enough. Many big bosses are not as good as you. You don't have to do it anymore. Besides, you're so big. There aren't so many tasks for you. If there was something for Huaishur would get up and stomp his foot, and the thing would be gone. The team of kobolds that accidentally fell into his mouth when they brushed his teeth last time had not crawled out of his stomach yet. Usually, when he sneezed, the whole city would shake. Every few days, when he held a mountain edge and ground his teeth, the people in the geological observatory wanted to collectively hang themselves. And when he was sleeping and snoring, the ones who wanted to hang themselves would be everyone. Too annoying. Too annoying. Wait a minute. Huaishur's mind flashed. I can also provide a 24-hour disco service. Afraid that his words were not convincing enough, he turned his head and turned on the colorful aperture behind him. Then, under the colorful changing lights, jubilant disco hymns sounded. You see, you can't ignore the construction of spiritual civilization in the apocalypse. Huaishur proudly raised the corner of his eyes. I'm not bragging. When I opened the evil spirit ancient. Ahem. When I opened the bar, none of the customers who came to play gave me a bad review. The undying bird's expression twitched. Sorry, this kind of help is really not needed. But looking at Huaishur's enthusiastic eyes, he could not say anything to refuse. Thinking that Huaishur was only 17 years old, he could not help but sigh. This child was really not easy. Not to mention his excellent resume and solid work style, but what was rare was his sincerity toward the organization. Unlike his former subordinates, who would let them touch all the fish ponds, but they would not work. It was just that his snoring was a little louder. But no one was perfect. It was understandable that there were some small shortcomings. Moreover, he could understand Huaishur's current mood. He could not help but jump up and pat him on the shoulder. He sighed sympathetically. You put all the evolutionary direction into your body. I'm afraid you don't have much combat power, right? Yes. Huaishur nodded crazily. Don't be afraid. No matter what, the Astronomy Association does not have the habit of abandoning the weak. What's more, we are all on the same side. The undying bird comforted him earnestly. You can sleep and eat without worry. Not to mention anything else, we, Stone, have enough. We won't chase you away because you're in the way. Huaishur was stunned. That's not what I meant. I understand. The undying bird nodded in agreement. I can understand that you want to do more. Young people need an occasion to show their abilities. But everyone has a division of labor, right? You have to do your irreplaceable part well. Gold will always shine, don't worry. He looked around, preparing to draw some kind of pie to calm Huaishur down. But after blindly looking around, he really couldn't find any Huai poems that could be written. In the end, he came up with an idea and pointed to Huaishur's back. If you really want to contribute more, how about I find someone to make a few wedges on your back in 2 days and put on a frame for us? What are you doing? Huaishur was at a loss. Of course, it's a necessary risk measure. The more the undying bird talked nonsense, the more proficient it became. Although it felt a little guilty in its heart to deceive the young man, it really could not bear to let Huaishur down. It could only talk more nonsense. Look, aren't you big? After the frame is set up, if there are any natural disasters or something like that, you could just carry our base and run away. After saying that, even it believed itself. You're really a genius. He could not help but praise himself in his heart. Really? Huaishur was a little doubtful. Of course it's true, the undying bird said in a trembling voice. It's more real than real gold. I'll ask someone to put the frame up for you later. Anyway, the steel used was produced by the smelting center. Recently, there was a bit of excess production. Instead of leaving it idle, it was better to use it as waste. Well, later on, assign the scholar who fooled around with steam power every day to come over. At the same time, give him some work to do so that he would not kill himself when he was free. It was killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.